Hello, fictional. Welcome to the What If Issei. Today we are gonna see, what if Issei got harem with Sona? Part 4. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. I warned you, Selen, Fox said tersely over the communication circle. You made the decision to go after Argento. Shut up, Selen said irritatedly. I need your help anyway. And I told you, our hands are tied. Fox shot back. I'll make it worth your while, the rogue exorcist offered with a smirk. I also grabbed one of her friends. He's a sacred gear bearer. You could always use one of those, right? What's he got? Fox said warily. Looked like a twice critical. He only had it for a few seconds. MMPH. Fox didn't sound particularly impressed, but there was something else there now. They'd been not friends, their personalities weren't the kind that allowed for an emotional bond. Cordial acquaintances, though yes. They'd been cordial acquaintances for some time. So Selen could tell when the fallen angel's interest was piqued. Finally, Fox sighed. I suppose we could use another twice critical. There's an abandoned mansion several kilometers outside Kuo. Get there and hole up and I'll see what I can do. Good, I knew you could do it, Selen sneered, his tone approving, for him, anyway. The communication circle winked out of existence and he turned his attention back to his captives. Things might be slightly more complicated than he had expected, but he still had control of the situation. Keep moving, he said shortly, sneering. It'll all be over soon. First semi-clear day in almost 2 weeks, and this happens, Issei said in a mildly complaining tone. The two of them had teleported to the bottom corner of the grid and were getting their bearings. The timing does suck, Kaori agreed. Bet this weather is the only reason Selen didn't act earlier. She gave Issei a sideways look, her eyes concerned. How are your pyrokinesis going to hold up in this weather? She waved a hand to indicate the dreary damp, even if there was no rain, the mist was almost thick enough to cut with a holy sword. Ah-san said it should still work, he answered, his expression solemn now. She said it might be weaker, but it should still pack a punch. I just wish I'd brought more ammo to school with me today. He gave her a sideways look of his own, just as much concern in his eyes, and nodded at his origiri. You ready to go with that? So, the knight told her friend. I think I figured out a trick from what Butchu told us. She glanced at Issei again. So try and smell her, I suppose. I guess so, Issei agreed. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on Asia's scent. The faint sweetness of breakfast cereal wait. He reached out a hand tentatively, starting to point to the left-hand side of the street. He was still getting that scent of cereal, but also notes of strong coffee that must be Amanagawa-senpai. There was a third scent mixed in, heavy and coppery with a strong whiff of smokiness. It took him a moment to realize he was probably picking up Selen, too. That scent felt like blood and gun smoke. This way, I think, he said carefully. In the end, it only took a few minutes to catch up. Selen seemed less than surprised. Well, he drawled, look who we have here. He looked at the sword almost lovingly, and Issei wondered queasily if he was going to lick the blade. A couple of shitty devils. Issei-san. Asia cried out. Let them go, Issei growled. Selen laughed. In front of him were Asia and Amanagawa, both of them dirty-faced and in torn clothes, but otherwise intact. Sure, you can have the jock. He's too dumb to know when water's wet, although you might find him useful for other things. One of his hands slid behind Asia, and her sudden blush and miserable look suggested what he might be doing to her. But Asia's mine. Issei froze, his expression livid. All at once, his entire body was suffused in the azure flame of his mother's family. You're pyrokinetic, too, Selen said, beeping his head and sounding interested. Leave them alone, Kaori snarled, loosening his origiri in its scabbard. The level, focused look on her face, coupled with the tautness in her body language as she tensed to draw, touched a chord in Issei. For a moment, he could actually taste that notional snickerdoodle, and he had to shake his head hard to get it back in the game. Maybe we'll let you walk if you give us your surrender right now. Maybe you can beat it out of me, Selen said in a mock-thoughtful tone, and all of a sudden he was lunging at Kaori. That jagged-looking sword of his was snapping around in a tight arc at an impossible speed, aimed right at her jugular. And it spanged off of enchanted steel. Kaori had made the most of her night speed to get her holy sword drawn and in a position to parry Selen's weapon. Still, it was clear that even a knight's reflexes were struggling to keep pace with a rogue exorcist. His origiri had met his blade at a very awkward angle for Kaori to sustain, and Selen knew it. His sneer said it all. Just as he was worried sick about Asia, concern for Kaori boiled up in Issei. It was worry for a friend and comrade, he told himself, and pretended that didn't sound whisper-thin, even to his own ears. He hurled himself at Selen from behind, body-checking the other man away from his friend. Even as Selen sneered and spun to face him, Issei unleashed a flurry of punches into his torso, each one wreathed in azure fire. Coupled with a rook's physical might, this was enough to send him flying. He didn't take it lying down, though. Somehow, he produced a massive pistol from nowhere and opened fire. Whatever kind of bullets it fired weren't normal, they glowed platinum, and the ones that grazed Issei left a very unpleasant tingle that probably wasn't just a matter of being grazed with a bullet. "Holy rounds, you shitty devils." Selen crowed. "You and your little bitch chew on those." He let another volley fly before turning and sprinting, presumably back towards wherever he had Asia and Amanagawa stashed. There was a series of ricocheting sounds behind him as Kaori desperately tried to parry the fusillade. As Issei turned to follow Selen, he heard his friend cry out in pain, and for a moment his heart went cold in his side. As he turned, he saw Kaori on her knees, clutching her side, blood trickling between her fingers. Her other hand had a death grip on Yuzorajiri's hilt, and she was gritting her teeth. She was a Shen-featured, but her eyes were steady as she looked at him. "I'll catch up," she gritted out. "I'll call Momo-san or Ryo-san keep after him." "Stay alive," he told her tersely. It felt very important that she hear that from him. "I want you to stay alive." He reluctantly whirled around again, bolting after Selen. "You do the same," she said softly, but he was already out of earshot. The rogue exorcist hadn't gotten too far ahead, maybe a few blocks. He really couldn't, not with Asia and Amanagawa in tow. In the residential area they were in, low concrete walls surrounded them, minimizing mobility for both of them. He also must have heard Issei's footsteps because he whirled and opened fire. The only really helpful thing he did was shove Asia and Amanagawa behind him, as much to keep his fields of fire clear as to keep them alive. Issei managed to dodge most of the bullets, but one grazed his shoulder, leaving another agonizing welt. "Enough of that shit," he thought, narrowing his eyes and reaching out a hand, yanking. The semi-automatic jerked in Selen's grip and he stared at it in genuine shock. That loosened his grip just enough for the gun to be pulled free, and Issei sent it spinning off into the darkness somewhere. "Telekinesis?" Selen wondered aloud in genuine surprise. "I didn't know you shitty devils were capable. Well, maybe my friends will take you apart and find out what's up. Maybe starting with that little cutie with the holy sword." He licked his lips. "I'd love to hear what she sounds like when she screams in." Issei didn't let him finish. Snarling, he let fly with a double Rekadan, and then another, and then another. At less than 15 meters, the double explosion sent Selen tumbling ass over to kettle, slamming bodily into a concrete wall. "Move your asses," he shouted at Asia and Amanagawa. "Don't tell us." Amanagawa started to protest, but Asia clapped a hand over his mouth and started trying to push him out of the way. Selen slumped to the ground but looked up with a death's head grin. Despite the impact crater he left in the wall, he moved as if he were only bruised. "Not bad, you shitty devil," he sneered. "Not bad at all. But not good enough, either." He hefted the jagged-looking sword he held, and suddenly he was in Issei's face, bringing the sword up into Issei's gut. The rook began whirling away, but he didn't escape unscathed. Selen's blade left a nasty lengthwise gash in his torso, and the sword's holy aspect made the pain worse than anything Issei had ever experienced. Screaming wordlessly, he swayed on his feet, fighting to stay upright. "Issei-san." Asia cried out in dismay. "Hyoudou?" Amanagawa seemed torn between concern and his still strong distrust towards Issei. He turned towards Asia and with clear reluctance, asked, "Asia-san, can you help him like you helped me?" "Don't you two go anywhere yet," Selen said lazily. He lashed out with a snap kick directly against Issei's wound and the rook screamed again, falling to his knees. "Get out of here." He gritted out, making a sharp motion towards his schoolmates. "I'll give you points for courage," the rogue exorcist mused. "But that won't save a shitty devil." He raised his sword. "Beep you." Issei managed to snarl, shaping one hand into a finger gun and firing a single Rekadan. The blast didn't hit Selen dead on, but the explosive area effect did slam him against the wall again. This time, Asia and Amanagawa didn't hesitate, dashing forward and huddling around the wounded rook. Issei reached out for Selen's sword, trying desperately to yank it free of his hands. The exorcist gritted his teeth, digging in his heels. The sword jarred and danced in his grip, but Selen managed to keep his hands on it. "That all you got?" He managed to sneer, but the sweat starting to bead his forehead showed the effort he was putting in. "Issei-kun." Both he and Selen turned just in time to see a massive dragon composed entirely of boiling water slam into the rogue exorcist. Selen screeched as the magical construct immersed him in superheated H2O, writhing and twitching before sinking to his knees, barely managing to keep hold of his sword. As he did, the temperature immediately reversed itself and fell through the floor, and the dragon froze, trapping Selen within. Sona came into view, her face tight with anger and worry. A magical circle hovered before her as she strode over to Issei. As she moved, she made a sharp motion to Ryo, who came trotting up with a healing spell already primed. Asia had already scrambled to Issei's side, though, and had twilight healing manifested. The two girls exchanged slightly miffed looks, then cast their healing magic simultaneously. I thought I told you not to run solo. Sona chided him while Rya began healing him. Sorry, Sona-san, Issei gasped, trying to grit his teeth against the pain. Bastard incapacitated Kaori, and I had to keep track of him. She needs looking at too. Momo is taking care of her. Right now I want you to keep your head in the game. Sona's voice was quietly angry, but only an idiot would miss the worry and concern behind the anger. The king keeping her rook on the proper amount of leash and the woman wanting her lover to stay safe were as one in this moment. And you can bet you'll be hearing about this from Tsubasa later, too. And me, Ikun, Rya said, and if her tone was softer, that same worry and concern was at the back of it. Now hold still. Holy aspected wounds are nasty for devils. Her hands glowed a bright greenish white and the pain started ebbing. And me. Asia's face was twisted into a pout whose cuteness robbed it of any actual effectiveness. You're too reckless, Issei-san. Between Twilight Healing and Rya's bishop talents, the wound was set right very quickly. The scarring from it, however, was surprisingly resistant. Look out. Amanagawa's cry drew their attention to the sound of ice cracking. They turned and stared as Selen forced himself to his feet within the frozen dragon and began hacking his way free from it. One particularly heavy chunk went flying towards Asia. Amanagawa threw himself into its path to protect her, for some reason thrusting a fist into the air as he did. For a moment, a red armored gauntlet flared into existence around the fist and it shattered the chunk of ice like a cheap glass. Sadly, one of the larger fragments caromed hard off his forehead, putting his lights out. He dropped to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut, the gauntlet vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. What the hell was that around his hand? Issei shouted. That happened before, Asia said, shaking her head. She dropped to one knee beside Amanagawa, shifting Twilight Healing's power from Issei to him. He'll be fine. Senpai has a hard head, Rya added sardonically. Asia-chan, you'd better get him. He's too heavy for me, the former nun pointed out diffidently. She started trying to lift him up anyway. Rya sked softly, pausing in her healing of Issei's wound. What was left was pretty much cosmetic anyway. She cast another magical circle and a purplish white light suffused Asia. That's a strength enhancement spell, she said hurriedly. It should last long enough to get us to safety. Understood. Asia said. She continued lifting Amanagawa, apparently finding him to be much more manageable now, and slung him over one shoulder like a sack of flour. No bridal carry for him. Rya managed to joke. Asia just made a disgusted sound. It was hard to blame her for not being in the mood for mid-battle banter, particularly after the afternoon she'd had. The communication circle appeared next to Sona's head and the magical circle before her multiplied into a dozen. Tsubaki, I need you. Get the rest of the peerage to this location, immediately. Yes, Kaichu, Tsubaki's level voice replied. Rya-senpai is en route as well. Estimating 90 seconds for our arrival and 3 minutes for hers. She paused, then added wryly, Tsubasa is asking me to pass on to Hyoudou-kun that she's gonna give him a piece of her mind. Of course she is, Issei sighed. He looked down at the unconscious Amanagawa and sighed. The really annoying part is that this is you trying to be helpful. Not bad, bitches. Selen crowed. Pretty good, in fact. I may keep you alive for a little while, little Miss Four Eyes. The pair of blue-white explosions slammed him back into the wall again, the crater nearly piercing the wall this time. Issei had both hands outstretched before him and shaped into finger guns, blue-white flames dancing around them. You're not touching my wife, he snarled. Do try not to get too far ahead of us this time, Ikun, Rya said in a tone of good-natured sardony. She summoned a half-dozen magical circles, each one wreathed in lightning. Indeed, Sona agreed, smirking. Please cover me, Anata. The dozen magical circles before her began to bubble over with water, and vicious-looking aquakinetic serpents poked their heads through, baring their fangs. Like their predecessor, they were fashioned from boiling water and were clearly poised to spring forward like spears. You got it, Sona-chan, Issei agreed. Like her, he used his private endearment for her automatically. Rya just smiled in fond bemusement and concentrated on the healing. He leveled his finger guns again, starting a mental countdown. The smoke from the Reka-dan cleared and Selen came surging out of it like a thunderbolt. Sona launched her water serpents, eyes narrowed as she mentally commanded them to home in on the rogue exorcist. Somehow, though, he was just a hair too quick for them and the friction in the air from his passage actually dissipated half of them as he dodged from side to side. Bastard. Issei roared, opening fire again. His Reka-dan didn't have that homing ability, at least not yet, but he was good and pissed, and will and desire were the bread and butter for a devil's magic. He began trying to lead his target, guesstimating where Selen was going to land, and finally scored with a double Reka-dan that sent him flying headfirst into the wall. Or, at least, it should have. Instead, at the last moment, he slammed his sword ahead of him into the concrete to arrest his motion. He then used it to swing himself back up and around, yanking it free and using the wall as a springboard. Only the facts that Rhea hurriedly reshaped half of her magical circles into shields, and Sona hastily redirected her remaining serpents to superimpose themselves as additional blockades, kept Issei from being impaled. "It's that damned sword," Issei growled, backpedaling. "I don't know how, but it's making him fast. Even faster than Kaori or Basa-chan when she's using momentum pillage." He shifted the unconscious Amanagawa again, trying to find a more comfortable grip. "No dice." Selen laughed, the sneering sound somehow like broken glass scraped down a chalkboard. "Don't you shitty devils know anything about the Excaliburs?" He held up the jagged-edged sword as if it were a first-place trophy. "This is Excalibur rapidly. With this sword, I'm the fastest beeping swordsman in the world." "So it's one of the Excaliburs," Sona breathed, eyeing the sword as if it were a particularly poisonous snake. "Be very careful." "Let me guess, it's the most powerful holy sword?" Issei asked, trying to stoke his flames. "Only Durandal and Caliburn are more so," Sona answered in all seriousness. "Contact Yugashi-san. Ryo-san, too, if we can. We'll need to fight fire with fire." She gritted her teeth as Selen threw himself forward again, pouring her power into reinforcing Rya's shields. "Keep moving." They backpedaled quickly, Selen cackling as he pressed the attack. Rya's shield held, and Issei kept firing, but the rogue exorcist kept moving too fast to get a decisive shot in. As they fell back, Rya formed communication circles, struggling to do that, move, and keep the shield manifested simultaneously. Sweat beaded her forehead from the effort. Shizuku's voice was the first to answer, and her tone was brisk, as if she was already moving. "Kusaka-san." "Hi, senpai," Rya answered breathlessly. "We need help with Selen. Please bring your holy sword." "Understood." Rya could all but see the sharp nod that Shizuku's tone implied. "I'm already on the move. Keep this channel open, so I can home in on you." "Done," Rya replied, just as Akun's mom piped up. "Rya-san. Ryo-san, we really need help." Rya winced as Selen scored a near miss on Akun. The rook hissed in pain again, and the bishop had to squelch the urge to drop everything and focus on healing him. And, being Hyoudou Issei, despite having suffered another wholly aspected wound, he shifted himself around again to give her, Sona, and Asia maximum coverage. It was both endearing and exasperating. So much for her having to worry less now that he was a rook. "Rya-san. What do you need help with?" Ryo's voice was slightly perturbed now. Rya shook her head. "Sorry. We need help. It's a rogue exorcist. He's taken Asia-chan and another student hostage, and he's attacking me, Kaichu, and Akun with a holy sword." Ryo inhaled sharply. "I'm on my way." "Thank you." Rya narrowed her eyes as another sword strike grazed Issei again and summoned another half-dozen magical circles. Lightning bolts spat from them, not unlike a magical Gatling gun, all of them aimed at Selen's center of mass. This time he was a hair too slow on the trigger, and he actually took the hits, snarling in angry pain as he did so. Somehow, he managed to stay on his feet despite his body crackling with multiple electrical discharges. "Promotion. Queen. Absorption line." Saji's voice called out. Rya blinked. How did a minute and a half take so long? It had felt like they'd been fighting Selen for hours. With a sigh of relief, she saw the glowing tendrils from Saji's sacred gear snake outward and attach themselves to Selen and to Kaori and Tsubasa. The knight was now back at full health and looked at the rogue exorcist with icy fury. The rook smirked cruelly, cracking her knuckles. Rya couldn't help a slight smile. It was rapidly starting to seem that hurting Akun was the surest way to bring the full weight of Kaichu's peerage down upon an enemy. She could relate. "What the hell?" Selen faltered, staring down at himself and then at his sword. His movements were still swift, but only swift, not godlike. He whirled to face Saji, looking enraged. "You shitty mother-beeping beepsicking devil. Go to hell." Saji yelled back. As far as witty retorts went, it wasn't especially original, but Selen's opening salvo hadn't been particularly clever, either. And no one present could disagree with the pawn's sentiment. "You love this, then," Tsubasa said in a blithe voice. She threw herself at Selen, demonic energy surrounding her fists, and began throwing punches. For the first time, the rogue exorcist found himself facing someone he didn't hold a mobility advantage over. Discarding tactics for ferocity, he let out of a scream of rage, throwing himself bodily at the rook, with Excalibur rapidly moving in a wickedly tight series of arcs. Tsubasa started dancing around him, momentum pillage sapping his speed further and granting it to her, and her punches started connecting faster and harder. Sona's mouth quirked slightly upward. Selen had just committed himself, and she had most of her peerage present, with reinforcements on the way. Between Saji and Tsubasa, his speed advantage was being neutralized, and all he had was willpower and combat experience. Nothing to treat lightly, but the balance was shifting towards her peerage. And with Shizuku and Ryo en route. She dared let herself hope this could be ended without anyone else being seriously injured. That is, until Tsubasa was just a hair too slow in dodging Excalibur rapidly. The holy sword slashed a deep crimson wound diagonally across her torso, causing her to stumble and spin away. She gritted her teeth, staying on her feet, her expression one of fighting back agony by sheer force of will. The power being leaked from the exorcist via absorption line seemed to bolster her rook piece's resilience, but that wound wasn't closing. Sona heard another sharp intake of breath and saw that Issei had turned sheet white again. He was hurling himself forward, blue flames awakening around his hands. As he clenched them into fists, the rekage of the iron lampist rose from the ground, crumpling into razor-sharp shards and arranging themselves around his fists like an impromptu pair of cesti. That's new, she thought as she summoned forth another water dragon. This one was very nearly frozen, more like her sister's Celsius cross-trigger in serpentine form. Effective, though. Selen was still slowed in his movements. He didn't notice Issei bearing on him until the flaming cestus connected with his jaw and he went flailing into the nearest wall. He was grinning as he came back up though and whirled his blade up and around, bringing it crashing down towards Tsubasa. His origiri met it again and Kaori's icy fury had turned her eyes into chips of frozen mahogany. This time, she moved faster and more fluidly than Selen, her holy sword moving like it was a part of her body. Her eyes met Issei's, warming fractionally, and after a moment's communion, they began weaving in and out of each other's strikes, continuing to pile on the bodily trauma. Tsubasa let out a shaky sigh of relief and let them take the brunt, staying in the fight just enough to keep draining Selen's speed. Selen managed one last vicious rally, a backhanded swipe that Kaori barely managed to parry. The force behind it still sent her skidding across the street and she slumped against the wall, panting and bruised. The rogue exorcist swung Excalibur rapidly upwards, aiming for Issei's neck. Another blade interposed itself, this one wreathed in white-hot plasma. Sona blinked. That was clearly Aim no Ohabari, but the woman wielding it could have been Kaori's slightly older sister. Realization crashed down on her. It was far from uncommon for magicians to age slowly or to have access to spells that would extend their youth. Issei was staring in shock, the fact that he was centimeters away from being beheaded suddenly gone from his mind. His face was now cherry red, Sona knew that he had just figured out who she looked like. "Kasan," he squeaked. "Hi, son," Ryo said calmly. "Move, please." Issei's body heard the words, even if his mind was still stalled. He stumbled out of the way, and the Azure Conflagration Princess went sword to sword with Selen. Tsubasa stuck close to make sure his momentum was still draining, but her face was now a shen. "The Aikaji Heim," Selen sneered, not bothering to conceal the leer he directed at Ryo. "I've always wanted to cross swords with you." The leer widened. "Others things, too." "You couldn't handle me," Ryo retorted, and she was suddenly wreathed in the blue flame that was her namesake. The plasma around the holy sword's blade turned blue, and as she whirled and slammed it hard into Excalibur rapidly, a Rekadan-like explosion threw him back into the wall yet again. "Now!" Sona cried out, an inexorable note of command in her voice. She pointed, and the ice dragon surged forward with a howl that chilled the air for 100 meters around. "Issei-kun. Railgun, now." "Right." Issei yelled, thrusting his hands into his jacket pockets. They came out with handfuls of bundled together roofing nails, and electrokinesis flared to life around his arms. He shaped his hands into finger guns, and the bundles of nails started spinning around his arms and hands like a Gatling gun. "Wait." Kaori's voice rang out. Get him into the center of the street under the light." Selen laughed, even as blood trickled from between his teeth. He was finally, genuinely starting to show signs of being overwhelmed. You couldn't really tell from his expression, though. The blood notwithstanding, of course. "You shitty beeping devils. And you stupid Shinto bitch. Like I'd lay down and die for the likes of." He went stumbling into the center of the street, framed under the streetlights as if for a photo, as Kaori launched herself at his back. As he turned to scream at her, bringing his sword around, she hurled herself backward, jerking Yuzorigiri oddly. The shadows pooled around his feet suddenly turned into insubstantial-looking black blades. They made a very substantial sounding noise, however, as they lanced upward, piercing through his torso like a butterfly being pinned to a display case. At the same time, Tsubasa managed one last vicious kick, filling the air with the sound of pulverized ribs. She then sank to her knees, clutching her wound. At the same time, Issei yelled railgun. And mimed a firing motion. This sent 36 roofing nails screaming into Selen's gut at nearly 5 times the speed of sound. At the same time, the blue-white plasma around Aim no Ohabari lanced out like a burning arrow, striking his skin at a high enough temperature to vaporize it on contact. About 3 seconds after that, Sona's water dragon crashed into Selen like a Mack truck, coiling around him. This time, there were no games with temperature, no attempt to capture him. The dragon merely closed its jaws around his neck as he screamed, defiant to the last, and snapped them shut. There wasn't enough of him left for an autopsy to ID. They never did figure out just who landed the actual killing blow. In the end, they ended up simply ceding the kill to Saji, who had spent nearly 5 minutes apping the rogue exorcist's power with absorption line and feeding it to Sona and Issei. The pawn had promoted to queen and was swaying on his feet by the time Selen was vanquished, but he was still upright and alert enough to smile in thanks. Sona immediately dismissed him, sending Ruruko and Momo to make sure he ate something and got home safely. The first thing Tsubasa did, once Asia and Momo had healed her, was smack Issei upside the head. He winced, not even a rook's constitution would let him get away without feeling another rook slap. "Don't do that," she snapped, and yet again he saw the worry and concern that underlay that anger. Her hand lingered against his cheek. "Don't do that again." Another, softer slap resounded off the back of his head. Rhea's voice chimed in, "At least not against crazy exorcists with holy swords." Her hand moved to his back, patting his left shoulder gently before withdrawing. "Roger that," Issei sighed, rubbing his head. He turned a sardonic eye on Kaori, silently glad to see her healed. "Anything you want to add?" "I'm not gonna slap you," she sighed. "After all, I told you to go running after him." Instead, she hugged him briefly, and after a moment, he returned it with equal brevity. The two of them withdrew quickly, as if afraid of being burnt. Sona was less restrained. She slapped Issei as well, although there was virtually no force behind it. "Never again," she said softly. "Yes, Kaichu," he said with utter seriousness. They slumped against each other, clinging together like two souls lost in a storm. "He's dead?" Asia asked, still shaking from the adrenaline crash. Beside her, Amanagawa was unconscious on the ground. Once the former nun had confirmed that he was physically intact, no one had seemed in a hurry to wake him up, not even Shizuku. Goru had finally caught up, having been delayed at work, and was more than a little chagrined at not having been able to help. "Yes," Sona assured her. "Selzen's gone. He won't bother you again, Asia-chan." The words did little to reassure the former nun. "This is never going to end, is it? There's always going to be someone who'll come after me, wanting to make me work for them. Or to kill me and take these things." She held out her hands, flashing the manifested twilight healing rings. "It's not going to stop." "Let him try," Issei said resolutely. "We'll kick their asses each time. We won't let them take you anywhere, Asia-chan." "No, we won't." Rio added her voice to the reassurances, and the three teenagers looked up at the note of authority in her voice. "Asia-chan, I have a possible solution." "What is it?" Asia looked wary but hopeful. "I can arrange for you to join one of the magicians' associations," Rio explained. "Your sacred gear may form the basis for your healing ability, but I believe you have magical potential in general. And almost no one gives grief to a magician registered with one of the associations. Particularly if you're the contracted magician of a high-ranking devil." Everyone blinked in surprise as Riaz joined the conversation and turned to look at the Gremory heiress. "It's common for magicians to make such contracts, and their partner is bound to ensure their security." She smirked slightly. "Messing with a devil's contracted magician is generally considered a particularly stupid way to commit suicide." "Are you offering to contract with Asia-chan?" Sona asked curiously. "It would probably be seen as too much a conflict of interest if you were Serafal Sama did," Riaz pointed out. "And I'm still effectively short a bishop. A contracted magician would be a good substitute." Asia trailed off as she processed what she'd just heard. "Of course, I could just give you my second bishop piece instead," Riaz offered. "My family is known for how well we treat our retainers. I'm sure Sona and Hyoudou-kun would vouch for that." "Riaz is correct," Sona said thoughtfully. "That is one of the House of Gremory's claims to fame." Asia pursed her lips, thinking. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. Gremory-san, thank you, but can I put a pin in that for now? Perhaps, after I've been a magician for a while." "Sure." Riaz nodded. "It's possible to be both, after all. And it's best to take an evil piece after considering it carefully." Goru and Rio exchanged looks. "Asia-chan," Rio began, drawing the girl's attention, and cleared her throat before continuing. They often streamline the process if it's for a member's relative or child. Helps to keep things in-house as it were. Which means if you'd like, we'd be happy to make you a formal member of the family." Asia stared at Goru and Rio for a moment before the words fully processed. When they did, she resumed, trembling from hope and fear and joy. "Really?" "Yes," Goru said, his voice thick. "It's the very least we could do. To make sure you have a home, a happy life. Not just because you're Daria's niece. Because you're you, Asia-chan." Rio nodded firmly, clearly not trusting herself to speak. "We'll be your home, Asia. For real, this time," Issei promised, grasping her hands. Sona laid her hands over his and she squeezed their hands as well. Yes. Asia sobbed tears of joy. Nai-san, Sona Nisan as Goru and Ryo threw their arms around her, she pulled Issei and Sona into the big awkward group hug. I'm going to get Kaki-kun out of here, Shizuku told Riaz softly, unwilling to interrupt the group hug. She had the unconscious Amanagawa slung over one shoulder and despite his relative bulk, she handled him like he was a small sack of potatoes. I want to find out just what he was thinking, getting involved here if he was thinking at all. Good idea, Riaz said, offering the Kyoto faction observer a bow. Thank you for your assistance tonight, Yugashi-san. I was glad to help. That Selen should have been cast out of the Vatican with a bullet in his head. Shizuku's voice was unusually sharp. Something happened to him while we were fighting Selen, Asia said hurriedly. For a minute he had something around his hand. Something like an armored glove. Eyes snapped to her and she shrugged helplessly. It was only there for a moment. Selen thought it was a sacred gear of some kind. Thank you for telling me that, Asia-san. I'm glad you're safe. I'll need to talk to Kyoto about things, then. There was a slightly flinty note in Shizuku's voice, a warning not to push right now. Riaz and Sona exchanged glances and after a moment the former girl shrugged. Well, then. Have a good night with a nod, she hauled Amanagawa away like she was carrying a backpack. This time, the victory party involved karaoke. And this time, it wasn't the rec center in Kuo. No, both Sona and Riaz peerages teleported to the underworld to one of the largest amusement centers in the Gremory territory and staked out the largest room. And, as the guest of honor once again, Asia was pushed in front of the mic first. Remarkably, it didn't take her long to find a song she wanted to sing. Even more remarkably, it wasn't a hymn, but instead a song she mentioned being one of Cousin Dulio's favorites. Hearing someone sing about experiencing a spiritual reawakening in Memphis was a novel experience for devils, to say the least. No one could deny the soft-voiced life she brought to the song, though. The fact that the church was now forever denied to her made the performance surprisingly moving. Before the party could falter into wistfulness, Tsubasa claimed the mic and launched into Phoenix's Listomania. The upbeat frenetic opening keyboard and guitar started lifting the energy levels in the room, and even if she and Issei were the only ones in the room who really knew the song, the screens made it easy for everyone to sing along, with varying degrees of skill. By the time she polished off the song, everyone had a second, or, in some cases, third, wind. Hey Kiba. Issei reached out, gently pulling the knight over to the student council side of the table. You and the Fukakechu should talk blades. I mean, there's some similarity between swords and polearms, right? Some, but Kiba began. Issei motioned frantically to Sona and Riaz. The former cleared her throat. Actually, I think the asymmetry would be good for you to discuss in terms of a joint training program for our peerages. All our weapon users should be on the same page. Don't you agree, Riaz? I certainly do. The orc president had quickly picked up on the script and was putting some real enthusiasm into her voice. Hyoudou-kun, why don't you and Tsubaki-san talk it over now? I have time if you do, Kiba-kun, Tsubaki said, not quite meeting his eyes. Sure, Kiba said slowly, still looking slightly lost. Let's do that. And while you're doing that, Sona-chan will sing something with me, Issei said, taking his fiancée's hand and tugging her to her feet. And I'll go and get something to drink, Riaz said lazily, standing up as well. I'll have some snacks sent over to you too. That wasn't exactly subtle, Issei-kun, Sona said amusedly as he pulled her towards the song console. If I tried to do it subtly, it still wouldn't be done by the time I graduate, the rook replied with a grin. Besides, look. They're starting to talk. Sona looked and smiled. Indeed they were. It was awkward and stilted, but the ball seemed to be rolling. And, most importantly, it was free of the last party stiffness. Across the room. Riaz gave Issei a thumbs up and he returned it. Somehow, it was unsurprising that she smelled like watermelon-flavored ramyun soda to him. Not a thing wrong with it, just not his type. Programmer, rook, pyrokinetic, dragon, and now matchmaker, she joked. I'm starting to think a mutation piece was a cheap price. Yeah, well Issei reddened slightly and blurted out, but I get to be with you. So I'm the one getting the bargain, really he rubbed the back of his head, feeling embarrassed. We're both fortunate. Let's leave it at that, Sona told him and squeezed his hand. Her expression shifted towards thoughtfulness. Would you mind if I did one first before we do a duet? Go right ahead. Issei looked pleasantly surprised and passed her the song catalog. Sona flipped through it for a few minutes, finally finding something she seemed pleased with. When she found it, she keyed the song number into the terminal and picked up a mic. Hers was next in the queue and the others looked over in surprise. Bakeno was the current singer. Issei had never heard the song, which appeared to be about September girls, before. It was far more bittersweet and wistful than he'd have expected from the Gremory queen, but she did it justice. As she finished her song, she curtsied to the enthusiastic applause and gave Issei a knowing smile. As he'd expected, her scent was something sweet and deadly, a flower he'd discovered was called white oleander. She offered Sona the mic, and the Sitri heiress took it, clearing her throat and stepping to the center of the room. An understated percussion intro was followed by a guitar and piano, establishing a gentle, soothing melody. Sona didn't even bother looking at the screen, instead starting to sing in a soft, earnest voice at exactly the right moment. Clearly, this was a song she knew well. Hum away with me in the night. Hum away with me. And I will write you a song. Hum away with me on a bus. Hum away where they can't tempt us. But they're lies. Her eyes found Issei's and fixed onto them. The rest of the room and its other occupants faded into the background as she continued to sing. I want to walk with you. On a cloudy day. In fields where the yellow grass grows knee-high. So won't you try to come? Hum away with me and we'll kiss. On a mountaintop. Hum away with me. And I'll never stop loving you. The song shifted into a brief instrumental break. As the guitars flat-picked their way gently through the break, both of them drew breath. And I want to wake up with the rain. Falling on a tin roof. Well, I'm safe there in your arms. So all I ask is for you. To come away with me in the night. Hum away with me. The song transitioned into a brief outro that mirrored the intro, and Sona clasped the mic in both hands and bowed as the last notes died away. The applause nearly blew the room's doors off. Issei might have been clapping and cheering loudest, but he certainly wasn't the only one. Sona beamed, her shoulders relaxing. She walked over to Issei and they grinned at each other for a long moment. Once again, the presence of anyone else in the room became a distant concern. Either sing something or kiss, already. This came from Riaz, who was looking at the two of them with a combination of amusement and envy. A laugh echoed around the room at that. Even Asia joined in, beaming. Riaz shook her head fondly and stepped up to the song console, making a choice of her own and picking up the mic. Issei had come to know her well enough to be unsurprised that she chose a J-rock classic. At least she seemed to genuinely know her way around Bui's bad feeling. I suppose we'd better find a song, then, Sona said dryly. I guess we'd better, Issei agreed, slightly red-faced. It took a few minutes of flipping through the catalog before they found something they could agree on singing together, and the realization of what the song was made them both chuckle and gently bump their foreheads together. After Riaz wrapped up Bad Feeling with some surprisingly effective vamping, Sona punched in their selection, while Issei grabbed the mics and passed her one. As the low-key, mellow intro started, he cleared his throat and launched into the lyrics right on the beat, his voice steadier and more firmly on key than he might have been given credit for. Never want to stand up for myself. Never want to get in the way, I said it. I don't know what the plan is. But you can share with me, cause I'll be listening here. At everything you say, I won't turn away. And I listen, open up my heart and I must say that I love you, so. Sona's voice joined with his on the chorus, her voice somehow freer sounding than with the first song. Certainly, her body language was more relaxed, as both of them swayed to the music. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than ever before. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than I've ever known. Sona claimed the second verse for herself, a note of surprising vulnerability entering her voice as she sang. Once again, she and Issei were taking little note of anyone else. It was probably just as well, given the approvingly amused looks most of the others were giving them. Even Saji was managing to keep most of his jealousy off of his face for once. Every day is a battle I face. Strange life I lead, but it's what you've decided. I'll give it all into your hands. Do what you will with me, and oh. I'll smile when you speak. Remember those times I was hoping for something. And shaking my head from all I've done. But you never left me. Their voices joined again on the chorus, and their swaying to the music seemed to synchronize. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than ever before. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than I've ever known. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than ever before. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than I've ever known. Sona's voice braided with essays for the bridge, starting quiet and building rapidly to singing the last chorus together with all their might. Give it up for you, I would give it up for you. I would give it up for you, I'd do anything for you. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than ever before. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than I've ever known. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than ever before. Ooh la love, I've fallen in love, and it's better this time than I've ever known. I have fallen in love. I have fallen in love. I have fallen in love. As the instrumental outro faded out, they slumped their shoulders and smiled with hell smiles at each other. They barely heard the cheers from Asia or the other devils. They didn't really hear Riaz gleefully urging them now kiss. Either, but they made it moot a moment later. I'm a little surprised they were okay with today, Issei observed, leaning against the wall. Sundays were usually spent working on combat or magical training, as opposed to being on school grounds. Instead, they were here in the afternoon and dressed, if not formally, at least nicely. Outside the window, the rain had returned, but it was light and faltering, a last gasp before sunny weather finally reasserted itself. I would have expected them to insist on whatever made things hardest for us. Some exorcists might have, Sona admitted. She settled into her chair, assuming her typical air of calm authority. Issei still marveled at how she was able to slide into that persona so easily. But this one has a good reputation for avoiding ruffled feathers. Tsubaki, you have the sword. Of course, the queen said calmly. She hefted the long, unremarkable gym bag onto the desktop. Now, the only question left is what we do with this. She indicated Selzen's gun, recovered from where it had landed in a neighborhood pool. The large chunky semi-automatic sat on Sona's desk. Even unloaded and with slide locked open, it looked menacing. I don't suppose you let me claim it as spoils of war, Issei said dryly. You can already shoot fire and lightning from your fingers, and you're effectively a walking coil gun, Sona countered. Exactly what makes you think you need it? I'm not planning on pulling any Chunubu crap with it, he said earnestly. More reverse engineering. If my sacred gear is supposed to let me create stuff with my mind, the more things that I know the ins and outs of, the better. I didn't think you would pull any Chunubu crap with it, Sona admitted. Alright. Ajuka-sama takes the ammo. And that stays in my apartment unless I give permission for it to go elsewhere. You can experiment with it all you like there. Deal, Issei said equably, pushing it back across the desk towards her. Sona slid it into a drawer just as the office door opened and Saji poked his head in. Kaichu, he said formally, the representatives from the Vatican have arrived. Thank you, Saji-kun. Shown them in, please, Sona replied. Saji entered with two people Issei had never seen before. The man was young-looking and handsome, with tousled blonde hair and green eyes, and wore the vestments of a priest. The girl beside him was pretty and serious-looking, with chin-length azure hair, save for a single forest green lock, and brown eyes. She wore a white hooded cloak with gold trim and carried a long bundle wrapped in a white blanket. Sona inclined her head respectfully towards the man. Signor Tullio Gesualdo. I'm honored. She motioned first at Tsubaki and then Issei. My queen, Shinra Tsubaki. And this is Hyoudou Issei, my fiancé and one of my rooks. He bowed politely in return. Miss Sitri. The honor is mine. Miss Shinra. He bowed again to Tsubaki and as he straightened up, he smiled at Issei. Hi Issei. It's been a while. Hi Issei smiled awkwardly. I'm really sorry, but I don't think I remember you. It's been a very long time. Dulio looked towards Sona. Issei's parents and I are old friends. He gestured towards the girl beside him. This is my colleague, Zenobia Quarta. Another of my parents' old friends, Issei mused. Ah, nice to meet you. He bowed quickly, first to Dulio, then to Zenobia. Sona joined her fiancé in offering Zenobia a polite bow. Welcome to Kuo. Thank you. The girl's tone was polite but slightly clipped, she clearly wasn't comfortable conversing with devils. Dulio gave her a gently reproving look and turned back to Sona. I understand you've disposed of freed Selzen. Yes. I'm afraid we didn't leave anything for a burial. Sona gazed at him levelly. I understand that the Vatican washed their hands of him. We did, Dulio admitted equably. Although, even with all his unsavory traits, there are those who wanted to bring him back and put him to work for us again. His lips thinned, showing what he thought of the people who would suggest that. But personally, I owe you and yours my gratitude. He will best benefit the world through his absence. I couldn't agree more, Sona said with a nod. So would Asia get kicked out of the church? Issei asked flatly. I've never met anyone so pure-hearted. Sona gave him a mildly chiding look, but didn't protest. Because she's a heretic, Zenobia retorted. She healed someone who turned out to be a devil. Doesn't your church teach you to help anyone who needs it? Issei shot back. So she lives up to those teachings, and they kick her out for it. Nice. The rook gave the young exorcist a dirty look. Don't talk like you have any right to judge us, devil, Zenobia sneered, her brown eyes flaring. Zenobia. Dulio snapped at the same time that Sona said Issei-kun. In a razor-sharp tone. The two subordinates froze, still glaring at each other. Issei-kun, calm down. Sona's voice was less sharp now. Zenobia, leave it alone, Dulio ordered. After a moment, Issei relaxed. Zenobia did likewise. They continued to glower in each other's direction, though. You're right, Issei. Dulio's soft voice was oddly loud in the sudden tense silence. Asia lived up to the church's teachings, and they kicked her out for it, but that was at least half manipulation by certain elements in Grigori. I would have put a stop to it had I been present, but I had been on assignment. He shook his head. I'll always regret that. Yeah, well, Issei shrugged uncomfortably. I guess I'm not blaming you. The church really dropped the ball with Asia, though. His expression became resolute. We won't. You can have her, Zenobia muttered, then flinched from Dulio's sudden, sharp look. I leave her in your hands, then, Dulio said. And please tell her that I'm sorry. We will. Sona's voice was firm, clearly determined to get things back on track. We have the holy sword that Selen was using. We're not sure where he got it from, though we have suspicions. She gestured at the long gym bag sitting on the table. Dulio unzipped it and whistled. Excalibur rapidly. There is no way he should have had this in his possession. In fact, the last I'd heard, it was still in Orthodox custody. Please, signored Dulio. Get this thing out of Kuo. Sona nodded at the gym bag. This cut a swath through our town and nearly killed Asia. There are already enough holy swords in Kuo, and I won't have one of the Excaliburs turned against my peerage. All right. I'll take care of it, Dulio replied in the most placating tone he could muster. Signor Dulio, why are you letting her order you around? Zenobia protested. Because she's right, Zenobia, Dulio answered levelly. He looked at Sona. You mentioned other holy swords. Shinto. That's right, Sona stated. More than that, I don't feel comfortable discussing. If you wish, I can arrange a meeting with the Kyoto Observer. Unfortunately, we're on a tight schedule, Dulio said, and he sounded genuinely regretful. Another time, perhaps. Shinto or not, shouldn't holy swords be in church custody? Zenobia insisted. After all, the Kusanagi. Special circumstances there, Dulio corrected her. Whatever certain members of the College of Cardinals may think, the rule is that weapons from other mythologies stay in those powers' hands. Might as well try and claim Jolner or the Brewmaster for Rome. Zenovia's mulish expression suggested that she'd be game to try, regardless of the repercussions, but she didn't protest further. Issei opened his mouth, but Sona shot him another look, and he snapped it shut. Dulio, clearly pretending not to notice the byplay, rezipped the bag and hefted it over one shoulder. Thank you, Miss Sitri. He inclined his head to Sona and then did the same to Issei. Take care, Issei. Tell your parents hi for me. Sure, Issei said, slightly surprised. You take care too. He pointedly did not bid Zenobia farewell, and she responded in kind. Once they were gone, Sona gave her fiancé a reproving look. Please don't pick fights with exorcists. Yes, please don't, Tsubaki added with a touch of wry humor. We've only just repaired the school grounds. Yeah, sorry about that. Issei rubbed the back of his head. I dunno. This was the first chance I had to get answers about Asia and the way that blue-haired girl was talking about her, like she deserved it. I understand. Sona picked up her cooling cup of tea. I didn't care much for her attitude, either. Still. It's a good idea to be cordial whenever possible, especially with as accommodating as the Signor was being. I take it he's pretty important, then. Julio Gesualdo is the most powerful exorcist in Vatican service, Tsubaki explained. Unbidden, she moved to the sideboard and began preparing a fresh pot of tea. If he'd been present for the battle, he probably could have taken on Selen by himself and won. He also has a Longinus Zenith Tempest. She smiled wryly. Yes, you could say he's pretty important. And he knows my parents. Issei looked both impressed and slightly afraid. At this rate, I half expect them to be drinking buddies with the Mayu or the Christian god. Sona chuckled at that. I suppose that would complicate seating at the wedding. She looked up at the knock on the door and called out, come in. Thank you, Ria's voice answered, and she entered. I passed the exorcist as I was coming in, she said. He seemed cordial enough. I can't say the same for his assistant, though. She and Issei-kun were having a mild disagreement, Sona said, her tone slightly sardonic. Hey, there's no blood on the carpet, Issei pointed out mildly. That's good. I'd hate to see the cleaning bill if there were, Ria said with a slight smile. Oh, I wanted to thank you again, senpai. Ka-san said that Asia-chan's meet with the magicians got scheduled without a hitch and that you helped arrange that. You're welcome, Ria said, her tone and expression suddenly serious. I wish I could say I'd done it out of the goodness of my heart. But the fact is that I need a second bishop very badly and a contracted magician makes a good substitute. Rias gave Issei a steady look. And I'm afraid that I'll be needing a favor from you. I don't know just when I'll need it right now, but I'll let you know. Okay, Issei answered in a dubious tone. Don't worry. It's something I don't think you'll mind doing. Sona, you know what I'm talking about. Can you please fill him in? Yes. I had a feeling about this. Sona's voice was unsurprised. Issei-kun, let's go home. I had a feeling, Issei said softly. The rating games with Riser's peerage that you were having us watch. Yes, Sona agreed softly. The two of them sat on her couch, cups of tea cooling on her coffee table while they leaned against each other. The chances that my peerage will face his in a rating game are definitely present, but Ria's will be facing him long before that comes about. And you think I'm the cheat code that'll get Ria-senpai free, he mused. You and Saji-kun and perhaps Kaori, Sona confirmed. Informal rating games allow for a king with an incomplete peerage to borrow pieces from a friend. When do you think this will take place? He asked. The agreement was that Ria's be free to do as she pleased until she graduated university. Sona finally reached for her cup, taking a drink before answering. But chances are good that Riser will push to have that moved up. If I were him, I'd give Ria's until high school graduation, as a goodwill gesture. Another long drink. That would give us ample train to train you three, both individually and in concert with Ria's peerage. Perhaps get you and Saji-kun to balance breaker. By graduation, you'd be a force to be reckoned with. Do you think he'll wait that long? Issei asked. He reached for his own cup, downing its contents in a single gulp. I don't know for sure, Sona admitted. If I were him, I'd want to aggravate Ria's as little as possible. But he's never been worried about how he gets along with other people. So I guess we just train as hard as we can in the meantime, Issei said softly. That's the reasonable guess, Sona said with a reluctant nod. Is it okay if we don't worry about that anymore tonight? He asked, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. That's perfectly fine. She snuggled closer to her fiancé, and they held each other for a long time, the light rain falling outside the only noticeable sound. What? Cadis stared at Asia in shock. You're Hyoudou Asia now. Asia nodded happily. Issei-san's parents Nai-san's parents our parents adopted me this weekend. It's all true, Issei confirmed in a casual tone. He was unmoved by the shocked eyes staring his direction. And, you know, I've always wanted a younger sibling, so. Ice, you lucky bastard. Issei had to recoil from Mitsuda and Motohama suddenly being in his face. Not only do you have a fiancé, even if she's a boring librarian type like the Kaichu. Don't call her a boring librarian. Issei protested. Ria nodded in agreement, looking miffed, and so did Aika and Kaori. But you have a brand new, not blood-related sister who's a real cutie. Motohama finished. As usual, he ignored Issei's protest about the insult to Sona. If you don't take advantage of this, you're not a man. And I suppose you two think you're experts on the subject. Aika drawled in a sneering tone, making the two boys flush and drawing snickers from the other female students in the class. Asia was the only girl in the class not to join in the snickering. That was because she was too busy looking at Issei in confusion. What's so funny, Nai-san? It's nothing important, Asia, he assured her with a grin. My friends made a stupid joke. A really stupid joke. Who's joking? Mitsuda and Motohama chorused, their cheeks still burning. Issei snorted in amusement and glanced out the window. The morning had dawned sunny and dry, for the first time in what felt like months. So far, the skies were clear. He hoped they'd stay clear for a while. Tsubaki stepped out of the bathroom, smoothing down her dress. She wore a forest green jumper dress with a dark gray blouse underneath and matching heels, and her long jet black hair was styled into a neat chignon, with neatly combed bangs. She had a clutch tucked under one arm that matched her dress, and she wore light blush. Or maybe she was actually blushing. Issei couldn't swear either way. You look wonderful, Tsubaki, Sona said approvingly. Issei bobbed his head in agreement. He didn't look quite like himself, thanks to Aika's illusion magic. You'll knock him dead, Fukakechu. Not before the movie is over, I hope, Tsubaki replied with a good-natured smirk. I keep wondering if it was a good idea to have Hyoudou-kun pick me up here. Of course it is, Tsubasa said with a grin. She sat perched on one arm of the couch. This way, you get our moral support. And he knows what he'll be dealing with if he screws things up. I'd really prefer you not pound Hyoudou-kun into a thin pinkish paste, Tsubaki replied, a touch of asperity in her tone. Still, her expression seemed at least a little pleased about the statement of support. There was a knock at the door. Momo, a good-natured smirk on her face, opened it and looked outside. Come in, Kiba-kun, she said aloud. You look quite dashing tonight. From most of the other girls in the school, it might have sounded like she was trying to make a move, but it was well known who the object of Momo's affections was, save, of course, for the fellow himself. Thank you, Hanakai-san, Kiba replied as he answered. He wore a dark blue suit with black dress loafers, a freshly ironed white Oxford shirt, and a red necktie. His eyes lit up as he spotted Tsubaki. Tsubaki-san. He crossed over to her. You look beautiful. Okay, she wasn't wearing blush, Issei realized. That was all natural, from the way she reacted to Kiba's words. Thank you, Hyoudou-kun. You look very handsome, yourself. Thank you. Kiba's face pinked slightly as well. Shall we? Enjoy your evening, Tsubaki, Kiba-kun, Sona told them, her expression almost maternal. The reservation at Silver Moon will be under your name, Tsubaki. Thank you, Kaichu. Sona's queen gave her a quick but grateful bow. Don't stay out too late, Issei added with a teasing grin. Both Tsubaki and Kiba turned even redder at that. Kiba found his voice first. "We won't," he said and turned towards Tsubaki, offering his arm. She took it and the two of them left the room. "All right, people," Sona announced in a tone that was good-natured but brisk. "Tsubaki may have the night off, but the rest of us don't. Issei-kun, I believe you have an appointment." "Yeah, that's right. Gasper's contractor," Issei confirmed. He glanced in the mirror and made a face. "This face looks really generic, Aika-san. It's almost uncanny valley." "Yeah, it is," Aika agreed. "But that's supposed to be part of the spell's effect. No one will remember what you look like unless they spend a few minutes really studying you." She smirked. "The clock's ticking, Ikun. It's Mr. Generic, or I rule 63U. "I regret introducing you to that," Issei groaned. "It's cute that you think I didn't know it already," Aika snickered. Fine, let's stick with this," Issei said quickly. "Perhaps you can rule 63 him next time, Aika," Sona said dryly. "I'll admit some curiosity." "Well, would you look at the time," Issei said in an even more hurried tone. This was a rabbit hole he was better off not exploring right now, precisely because the implications were fascinating. The speculative looks his peerage mates were getting made him a little uncomfortable. "Rya-san, if you would, please." "I'm pretty sure you're just delaying the inevitable," Rya teased. She manifested a teleportation circle for him anyway. Issei tried not to fidget as he stood in the hallway outside the corner office and glanced again at his reflection in the window. Or, rather, the reflection of the disguise spell Aika had cast upon him. If he was any more generic looking, he'd be a light novel protagonist, he thought wryly. Finally, a secretary knocked on the door and opened it and he got a look at the man inside. He was in his early 50s, a handsome and vigorous fellow long since gone to seed, with bags under his eyes. He was tapping away on his keyboard, his phone sitting next to his mousepad, and he looked up as the secretary offered him a clipboard. "Perfect." Issei closed his eyes, mentally reaching out to the phone. This was becoming second nature. The executive never noticed a thing. Of course, it helped that the secretary was attractive and that the executive was busy visually inspecting her assets. It was the work of a minute to find and memorize the inevitable text document that had all the executive's passwords in it. All the jokes about the older generations and technology seemed to apply here, he thought with some chagrin. It was a little disillusioning. It was just as easy to send him a text message from someone in his phone book. Whoever Akira was, her name or his sure got the executive out of the office in a hurry. As the door swung shut, Issei mentally applied the password and nodded in satisfaction as he saw the desktop in his mind's eye. He pulled the folded piece of notebook paper out of his pocket, double-checking the file names, and looked them up. As he'd expected, they were password protected, but the list of passwords had that covered. He quickly emailed the files to the burner phone he'd picked up, emailed those from the burner phone to Gasper, and took a few minutes to cover his digital tracks. By the time the executive had returned, Issei was already in the elevator, plugging a flash drive into the burner phone. In retrospect, Issei was unsurprised by the attempt at a double cross. Disappointed, but unsurprised. Sasaki was waiting in the parking garage of the office building across the street. He was a bespectacled, sour-looking fellow, giving the impression of a thwarted intellectual who saw everyone but himself at fault for his failures. Beside his sat a navy blue gym bag. "Well?" he said in a sharp tone. Issei reached into his coat, offering him the flash drive. "Here you go. All the files for the restructuring. There's a text document with the passwords." Sasaki turned the flash drive over in his hands, eyeing it suspiciously. "And there's no chance it can be traced to me." "None," Issei assured him. The chances were virtually nil anyway, especially with the burner phone having been turned to ash and dumped into one of the planters outside. It would take a magician or another devil to have any chance at reconstructing that. "Fine," Sasaki said impatiently. He nudged the gym bag with his foot. "There's the payment we agreed upon." "All right then," Issei said amiably. "You won't mind if I take a look first?" Sasaki's sour expression deepened. "You don't trust me?" "I trust you as much as you do me," the rook replied. His tone was still affable, but Sasaki's entire attitude was wearing thin. He dropped to one knee and unzipped the bag, rifling through the bundles of yen notes. Looked like the 20 million yen they'd agreed upon. They didn't look like any die packs. He concentrated for a moment and found no trace of the radio signal that would accompany an active one. Best to have Sona, Aika, or one of the bishops scan the bag, anyway. He zipped the bag back up and stood, hefting the strap onto one shoulder. "Everything looks good. Have a good night." "You too." Sasaki said the words heavily, almost resentfully, as if the act of wishing another person well was physically painful. After Issei had gone a few steps, he called out, "Wait. Take the southern stairwell. Security is lighter over there." He had pulled out his phone. "Sure," Issei said, turning in that direction. Once out of sight, he shook his head. That was so transparent. It really wasn't any wonder Sasaki's career was stalled. He was 3 floors away from ground level before he heard running footsteps behind him. He didn't bother turning around, they probably belonged to the same kind of people who were running up towards him. Guys in suits and sunglasses, reaching for collapsible batons. At least it was the worst he'd have to deal with. Issei let out a sigh and braced himself. 5 minutes later, Issei walked back onto the level where he'd left Sasaki. His expression was not a pleased one. Sasaki looked up, clearly expecting to see his security goons with a bag of money. He blanched and nearly dropped his phone. Issei strode right up to him, his eyes flinty. After a full minute of staring into the salaryman's watery brown eyes, he said levelly, "That was very stupid. Don't ever summon me again." His free hand shot out, tearing the rearview mirror off Sasaki's driver's side door, and he crushed it into powder. Understood. Yes, Sasaki's "I'm above you" attitude was long gone. Good. Issei's voice was stony. Your security people are in the stairwell. They're not too badly hurt. They should be all right if you get them to the hospital right away. I suggest you do that. His eyes narrowed. I also suggest that you pay out of your own pocket. Otherwise, they're liable to claim insurance and people will start asking questions. Sasaki nodded, looking like he was about to pass out. Or soil himself. Or both. Issei had no desire to witness either. He let out another snort of disgust and walked away. This time, he took the northern stairwell. I'm sorry about that, senpai. Gasper sounded genuinely distressed over Skype. I had no idea Sasaki-sen was planning something like that. Not your fault, Gasper, Issei quickly reassured him. He was finding Ria's bishop easy enough to get along with. His reluctance to use video chat was odd, but it wasn't off-putting. He'd seen way weirder stuff online. The hikikomori thing was something he understood, too, from personal experience. I think he'd just seen one too many heist movies and decided he was smart enough to pull off a double cross. That's a new level of stupid, trying to pull a fast one on the devil you summoned to pull a fast one on someone else. Sounds like you went easy on him, Aika noted, her tone one of slightly distracted concentration. She straightened up, the glow from her hands finally fading. Okay, the spell's gone. You look like yourself again. She smirked fondly. It's a bit of an improvement. Thanks, Issei said with a chuckle. Yeah, I guess I did, but he seemed more stupid than malicious. I won't ever deal with him again, though. He's all yours, Gasper. Alright. The bishop's tone was slightly glum but understanding, and Issei could almost hear him nodding. I'll make sure he doesn't ask for anything that can't be done remotely, then. You might be surprised what people will do to try and weasel out of their contracts, Hyoudou-kun, Riaz observed. Buyer's remorse is definitely a thing when people deal with the supernatural. She shifted her gaze towards Aika. The money's clean, then. Completely, the pawn answered. He actually had a die pack at the bottom of the bag, but also had the receiver. Never turned either on. She set the die pack and receiver on the desk. You weren't kidding about him being a dim bulb, Ikun. Riaz nodded in satisfaction, as did Sona. The latter asked, and the full amount is there? 20 million yen in stacks of 1 million yen, Aika confirmed. Her expression was slightly impressed, this was the most cash she'd ever seen in one place. Issei was in the same boat. Straight down the middle, Riaz said affably, and Sona nodded, turning towards Aika. If you would be so kind. Aika nodded and started to remove stacks of bills. Soon, 10 million yen in cash sat on Ria's desk. Alright then, Riaz said cheerfully. Hyoudou-kun, thank you for helping Gasper out with that. It's no problem, Issei said with a grin, turning back towards Gasper. Us computer nerds gotta stick together, right? Right. Gasper agreed with a chuckle. But will that be everything for the night? Yes, I think so. Good night, Gasper. Riaz killed the voice chat and turned the laptop back towards her, looking amused. Sona smiled slightly and shook her head, while Aika chuckled. The former nodded to Issei, who hefted the gym bag onto his shoulder. We'll talk tomorrow, Riaz. Have a good night. You too, Sona, Riaz replied. Hyoudou-kun, Kiryu-san, you as well. The three of them left the orc clubhouse, turning in the direction of Sona's apartment. Aika stretched and yawned and glanced over at Issei. Before I forget, maybe you can help me with a contract I have next week, Ikun. Sure, Issei said promptly. What's going on? Some kind of combined cosplay fortune-telling thing, Aika explained as they walked. The girl wants me to dress up like some Tahu character. What do you want me to help with? Mostly muscle. Make sure no one gets handsy with me that I don't want getting handsy with me. Maybe some it if necessary. Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem, Issei replied. He felt a momentary spike of irritation at the idea of anyone getting handsy with Aika, a thought overlaid with wondering what Tahu character she'd be cosplaying as. For a moment, the scent of peppermint ice cream grew stronger, more nuanced, and he tried to suppress a grimace. Once they were inside and Issei had set the bag down, Sona unzipped it and pulled one of the bundles of bills out. She unwrapped it, quickly dividing it in three, and handed one of the stacks to Issei and the second to Aika. The third she folded carefully and tucked into her pocketbook. The pawn and rook blinked, staring down at the unexpected cash bonuses. Aika found her voice first. "You sure about this, Kaichu?" "I'm sure," Sona replied. "It's not a usual thing, I'm afraid, but for particularly profitable contracts, it's not unknown for kings to reward the servants who executed them. Issei-kun handled the situation admirably, and your magic made sure no one could possibly recognize him." "Thank you," Issei said softly, carefully folding the bills and pocketing them. He chuckled. "That's probably in part going to our date in Kyoto, so I guess it's an investment." "I have other things in mind for that, too," Sona said, her lips curling upward slightly. Aika cleared her throat. "I think that's my cue. Night, Kaichu, Ikun." As the other two bade her good night, she summoned a teleportation circle and vanished. Sona watched the circle fade and let out a soft snort. "I really wish I'd had an unused bishop piece for her sometimes." "She seems to do pretty well with 3 pawns," Issei said philosophically and crossed to the fridge. "Bao okay with you?" "Yes, please," she agreed. "I'm going to change for bed." "Need a hand with that?" he asked lightly. "After we eat," she replied, her tone equally light. A minute later, he heard her voice call out from the bedroom. "Issei-kun, you don't have anything going on during Golden Week, do you?" "Oh, yeah, that's coming up soon, isn't it?" Issei smiled, pausing with his hand on the refrigerator door. "Nope, nothing specific in mind. You thinking about something?" "Yes, I am," Sona admitted. "I'd like to take you home with me so you can meet my parents." Issei gulped but nodded. "Sure. That sounds like a good idea." He grinned. "And anyway, it's a good reason to take a trip with you." "I'm glad you feel that way." Sona emerged, wearing sleep shorts and one of his t-shirts. "Also, I'd like to show you around the Sitri territory. It's largely undeveloped because Otu-sama is a big believer in conservation. But there are a few large towns, primarily around our family seat. And we have several smaller estates along the lakeshore." Her smile turned playful. "How would you like a few days alone with me at one of our lake houses?" "I'd really like that." Issei's grin threatened to turn lecherous and he wasn't putting much effort into restraining it. "Me too." Sona smirked at him and shook her head. "Shall we get started on dinner?" "Yeah," he agreed, starting to pull ingredients out of the fridge. "Man, now I'm gonna be thinking about that for the next 2 weeks." "I could make it worse," Sona teased. "Please, not till after dinner is finished," Issei said in a simultaneously wary and curious voice. "Well, alright." Sona kept smirking all the way through dinner, though. "So? How was dinner?" Momo asked with a smile. "Dinner was fine," Tsubaki said, doing her best to maintain quiet composure. Hints of a smile kept playing at the corners of her mouth, though. "And the movie?" Haruko pressed, virtually bouncing up and down as she did so. "The movie was good, too," Tsubaki answered. That smile was peeking out a little more. "Did he walk you home?" Tsubasa asked with a grin, sipping an energy drink. Tsubaki rolled her eyes at the friendly questioning. "Yes, he did. Are you done now?" "Just one more." That came from an unexpected source and they turned to look at Sona. They knew the student council president well enough to see the sparkle of mischievous humor in her eyes. "Did he kiss you goodnight?" Tsubaki was very still for a long moment. That was her equivalent of embarrassed fidgeting. Finally, she cleared her throat and the smile awakened fully. "I kissed him goodnight." Noises of approval rippled around the student council office. Even Sona smiled. Tsubaki looked around quizzically. "I'm surprised the others hadn't stuck around to ask." "Rya and Kaori had some classwork to attend to, and so did Saji-kun," Sona explained. "As for Issei-kun and Aika, there's someone else they're having to talk to." She grimaced slightly. "Sadly, it's about a far more annoying topic than your date." "You're kidding," Aika said incredulously, before adding, "Senpai." "I'm sorry, but no." Amanagawa Kaki's tone actually did sound almost regretful, Issei had to admit. The school regulations are very specific on the matter. For that matter, they're very specific about uniforms. He gave Issei and his half-unbuttoned uniform shirt with programming humor t-shirt visible underneath and his lack of a uniform blazer a disappointed look. By now, everyone knew that Issei's uniform blazer spent most of its time around Sona's shoulders. "It's a little unusual for someone to complain about club meetings and membership, senpai," Issei said, struggling to feign respectfulness. What he wanted to do was laugh in Amanagawa's face. "Particularly when you're not in the club. It's my duty as a senior student to make sure my cowhide aren't out of control," Amanagawa said. "And as a club captain, to make sure that other clubs aren't acting in a way that will adversely affect the rest of us." Issei's lips thinned. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Aika beeping her head and giving Amanagawa a politely annoyed look. It was more cordial than he felt like being at the moment. So if we don't bring our member numbers up to the minimum, you're gonna complain to the principal. Every club needs a minimum of 4 members, Amanagawa said stolidly. And to meet on a regular basis. If neither of those apply, then your club is a waste of school resources and needs disbanding. And, since your association with the council is based entirely around computers, there really wouldn't be a need for you to be there, would there? Anyone else would have said that with a knowing sneer. Amanagawa did not, instead, he spoke with utter seriousness, clearly seeing himself as a wise elder, correcting a foolish youth. Issei had hoped that, after he had helped save Amanagawa's life the prior week, the third-year student would leave him alone. Instead, he was even more in his face, but in an oddly friendly way. Instead of seeing Issei as an incorrigible evil, he now seemed to see him as a well-intentioned misfit who needed proper guidance from someone respectable. Namely, himself. Issei supposed it was better than being viewed as a delinquent, but it was even more annoying. Fine. We'll find the other 2 members, Issei said, his tone one of strained politeness. Will that satisfy you? As long as you do it by the end of the week, Amanagawa said. His expression seemed reluctant to admit to the loophole. I understand, Issei said. If that's all, senpai. Amanagawa nodded, but gave Issei a serious look. I'll be keeping an eye on you, Hyoudou. He cut his eyes to Aika. Kiryu-san, please keep me apprised on your club's status. Okay, senpai. Aika didn't bother to hide her dubious tone. The minute he was gone, she turned to Issei, looking exasperated. Is he for real? Issei's expression was one of reluctant mingled exasperation and amusement. Amanagawa's senpai thinks he's being clever. I think he honestly believes he's rehabilitating me. He said the word while making air quotes, which made Aika snicker. And even if it doesn't work, he probably believes it'll force me to limit my time with the council, or even resign and leave those poor helpless girls alone. He snorted. As if all of you couldn't flash fry me with lightning or something. Aika muttered something that almost sounded like as if we would. At Issei's surprised expression, she quickly said, as if Kaichu wouldn't just flash freeze you and carry you off first. The pawn snorted derisively. That guy, I swear, sometimes I think he's projecting. No one can be that pure-minded without their subconscious doing some serious churning. That's a frightening thought. Issei shuddered. He really didn't want to contemplate what could be lurking in Amanagawa Kauki's subconscious. I think you're right, though. I've heard stories about him and Shirasaki-senpai and the way he acted towards her anyway. We have to meet at least once this week and have until the end of the month to drum up the minimum 4 members. Including us, fortunately. See if anyone else on the council wants to. Aika suggested. And hurt, he said with a shrug and then grinned. Maybe I should leave that to my esteemed vice president. Oh, screw you, Aika laughed. Come on, but your fiancé's peerage doesn't bite. She paused, then added, as far as I know. Anyway, Issei said hurriedly. That was the last thing he needed to be thinking about right now. Who would you suggest? Aika gave him an amused sideways look and Issei had to wonder just how transparent he was. Actually, Haruko-chan. Sure, that sounds interesting. Haruko's expression seemed sincere about it too. I'm afraid I don't know much about programming, but I'm interested in learning. I'll teach you what I know, Issei assured her. We won't worry about any structured projects or anything like that unless you have anything in mind you'd like to focus on. Maybe. The pawn beat her head, looking at him speculatively. Do you know anything about programming cars, Ikas? I know just enough to know I know nothing, the rook replied with a helpless chuckle. Maybe that'll be our club project, learning the difference between that and desktop programming. He gave Haruko a speculative look of his own. That's right. Your uncle's a mechanic, isn't he? Haruko nodded. He's taught me some things, since neither of my cousins have an interest in it. She smirked. Papa isn't thrilled about it, but I think he's about ready to give up trying to keep me from being a tomboy. Hey, it's cool that you've learned some things, Issei said encouragingly. Maybe you can teach me. My sacred gear is supposed to let me create stuff when I get good enough with it and maybe that'll help. Deal? Haruko enthused. Issei grinned at her and turned to Aika. You can sit it out if you want. We'll see, Aika said speculatively. I would have just done homework anyway. She stretched and yawned. So, all we need is one more member. If you have ideas, I'm all ears, Issei told her. We need to get a club room too. And some computers. He decided, feel very comfortable with the sudden conspiratorial smiles that passed between Aika and Haruko. Excuse me? Issei looked up at the doorway and stared in surprise at who he saw standing in it. Nagahama. What are you doing here? This is your programming club, right? Nagahama was awkwardly holding a computer tower. Yeah, it is. Ah, go ahead and bring that on in. Issei motioned to one of the empty desks. My vice president Kiriwaika-san and our other member, Nomura Haruko-chan. She's in my class, Haruko piped up. Is something wrong with your computer, Mitsune-chan? She was all smiles. Huh? Oh, yeah, there is, the Kondoka said quickly. It's been running really slowly and you reminded me about your club, so. Well, we'd be happy to take a look, Aika said. Despite her words, she seemed content to perch on the counter, her legs dangling idly. Yeah, Issei agreed, eyeing the tower. Just set it on that desk next to the wall. He grabbed the storage container that held their spare cables and cords and fished out the required items. Haruko-chan, grab the spare monitor, please. The flat screen one. And the spare mouse. On it? The pawn said cheerily. How long has the problem been going on? Aika asked, languidly getting to her feet. For a moment, the afternoon sunlight hit her just right and Issei felt the scent of peppermint in the room briefly grow stronger. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or disappointment as it returned to normal, so he settled on both. Fortunately, neither Haruko nor Nagahama seemed to notice. The first year had turned to Aika and was answering her question. A few weeks now. Everything's running so slowly. As she spoke, Haruko was plugging in the cables and setting up the mouse. Do you mind if I download the antivirus I prefer? Issei asked. It's a little more robust than the one you have. Go ahead, Nagahama said, clearly surprised by their efficiency. Once the computer was on, Issei started downloading the antivirus and looking through its directory. 5 minutes passed in relatively peaceful silence before he looked up, trying not to laugh. Nagahama, does anyone else use your computer? Just my little brother. My parents won't get him one of his own. Ah. That explains a few things. Issei turned the monitor slightly so she could look at it better. There are a couple of hidden folders. I'm gonna assume that these games aren't yours. Nagahama looked at the file names and flushed. No. Those definitely aren't mine. Aika glanced at them and shook her head. Seriously? Eneki Midnight Train 4. That franchise shouldn't even have had a third game, given what they did with it. She let out another snort as she looked down for a list of files. And One E-Chance Secret Tutor Club 2. Another unnecessary sequel. Don't knock the One E-Chance Secret Tutor Club franchise, Issei said distractedly. The second folder is videos. They're pretty similar in content. He looked at Nagahama. I'll delete the folders and give the computer a virus scan. Thanks, the first-year student said. Her face was still red. Aki, you dumbus. Do I want to know why you know so much about Erage? Haruko asked Aika dryly. Aika just smirked. Issei deleted the folders and started the virus scan. Leaning back in his chair, he said conversationally, you look like you want to slug your brother right now. Can you blame me? Nagahama groused. Not at all, he agreed. But a word of advice. I think things may go over better if you don't bring up what he downloaded. Just talk about the fact that he used the computer without permission. He smiled wryly. Believe me. He should be less embarrassed or defensive and more willing to listen. Nagahama blinked, processing that. The entire visit to the club seemed to keep surprising her. After a moment, she said, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, senpai. There was a knock at the door and the four of them looked up. Issei quickly suppressed a groan as he saw Amanagawa in the doorway. Yes, senpai. I was just checking on your club, Amanagawa told him gravely. It's Friday, as we agreed upon. He looked around. Is this all your members? Yes, Issei had half forgotten about the minimum membership thing. He opened his mouth, but Nagahama spoke first. I just joined today, senpai. I'm Nagahama Mitsune, Class 1B Nomura Haruko-san is also a member. Ah. Amanagawa looked around again, and Issei couldn't tell if the older student were relieved or disappointed. Probably a little of both, really. Well, things seem to be in order here, then. I'll be checking in again later. With that, he left the room. Issei let out a sigh of relief and turned towards Nagahama. Thanks. Don't misunderstand, Nagahama insisted. It's just until you can find other members. I owe you for fixing my computer. Her cheeks were slightly red. Issei tried to ignore Aika's smirk and Haruko's giggle. Sure, no problem, he said calmly. The cliché was present in devil media just as it was in human media. Those plotting earth-shaking deeds of dubious morality and legality did so in dark, seedy taverns or in opulent private clubs, well attended by fronting servants. Rarely did the conspirators ever meet in a busy mall food court during the lunch rush or discuss their nefarious plans over burgers and fries. Yet that was exactly what was happening here. The Lucifer Grand Emporium was the largest shopping center in the Devil Capital, and at any given lunch hour, there were over 1,000 people in its central food court. When one factored in the nearby indoor playground and fountain with attached sitting areas, there were literally thousands of people present, eating, playing, or milling around. It was the best kind of natural anti-eavesdropping device, particularly when subtle usage of illusion magic was at work. No one had any reason to pay particular attention to the woman and two men eating burgers and fries. "So it's confirmed, then," the woman said sourly. Illusion magic presented her as dumpy and plain, a far cry from her true statuesque beauty. She wore an expensive tunic and skirt in garish colors, the very picture of a shrill housewife with more money than style. "It is," the dark-haired man with glasses confirmed. He, of the three of them, looked closest to his actual self, even with the rumpled business suit and necktie. "Both the Sitri and Gremory heiresses will be in Kyoto. The report says that it has something to do with the Sitri's fiancée's sister being inducted into Grozobur, but we all know the real reason." Further negotiations with Kyoto, the second man spat. Like the woman, his relatively dumpy and unattractive appearance was a jarring contrast to his true visage. He wore ill-fitting slacks and a sweater and slurped contemptuously at his iced tea. "They want to expand that non-aggression pact into an active military alliance. You know who that would be aimed at." His companions nodded grimly. The woman took another bite of her lunch and opined, "The two of them are hardly pushovers, though. The force we'd need to ensure their deaths would be substantial." "It's desirable, but not necessary." The dark-haired man smirked. "All we need to do is convince Usaka that an alliance with Gremory and Sitri is more trouble than it's worth. You want to shoot up Kyoto. Cause as much collateral damage as possible and make it clear there why it happened." The second man said this in a matter-of-fact tone. Completely absent was any consideration for the innocent people who would be caught in that notional crossfire. "Exactly," the dark-haired man said, mock saluting his co-conspirator with a French fry. "If we can take them out, all the better, but they're secondary targets. I'd rather concentrate more attention on Usaka and her main confidants." "Usaka is equal in power to an ultimate-class devil," the woman pointed out. "You're not seriously thinking of making a real play to take her out?" "It's tempting. There's always a certain appeal in making an example out of opponents. Poor encourager less orders and all that. But no. Seriously trying to do so would require at least one of us being on the scene. Two of us, if we wanted to be absolutely sure. That's a very poor idea right now." He shook his head. "No. We just want to scare the shit out of her. Concentrate enough force to make her think twice about irking us. That's the most we can do." The dark-haired man shook his head. "It's a pity we're not in a position to attack fully, but I think we can muster the forces for this." "It's a strategy of weakness," the second man protested. "I don't like it. If you have an army in your back pocket that you've been hiding, now's the time to produce it," the dark-haired man retorted. The woman pursed her lips and pointed upward. "Aware of the plan?" "In a general sense," the second man said. His tone had reverted to sourness. "Right now, I think he prefers not to know details." His sour expression curdled further. "Perhaps we should consider one more thing in this attack." As the other two looked at him, he explained, "Sitri's future sister-in-law, the one being inducted into Grozobur. She's a former nun, correct? Excommunicated for healing a devil." "Yes. How did you know that?" The dark-haired man blinked in surprise. "Our friend from the current Beelzebub's family was that devil," the second man elaborated. "He has something of a fixation on her. He'd probably be grateful if we could capture her for him." "It's nice to want things," the woman snipped back. The idea that the former nun or her family might have talents or connections was never even raised. "We can keep that in mind," the dark-haired man said. "It shouldn't be a priority, though. Not with the limited forces we can bring to bear." The second man shrugged. "Understood." "Wait." The woman's voice had suddenly gone quiet and deadly, and the two men eyed her carefully. "Who ate the last of the fries?" Orinkaku in early April was not particularly well populated, the Sakura viewing parties notwithstanding. That suited the woman who sat alone on the Fortress-turned-Park's observation deck, calmly sipping sake from an old-fashioned bottle. Anyone who saw her would have seen a gorgeous black-haired woman in a black kimono, with split bangs and the bulk of her hair up in a complex pair of rings. That was fundamentally accurate, though illusion magic concealed her cat ears and tails, as well as the fact that the kimono was half open, with most of her buxom figure visible. Her serene solitude was interrupted by someone sitting next to her. She glanced at the person, preparing a tongue lashing, and paused, recognizing her. "You're kidding me, Naya." "Hello, Kuroka-san." The other woman was also dark-haired and lovely, with her hair up in a high ponytail. She wore gray cargo pants, a black sweater, and a dark blue bridge coat. A silver ring glinted meaningfully on her left ring finger. "I had a feeling I'd find you here." "Yagashi Sumair." Kuroka snorted. "Kami save me from a Yagashi who knows too much, Naya." She knocked back another gulp of sake and gave the other woman an old-fashioned look. "What do you want?" The dark-haired woman sat beside Kuroka. Both women were silent for several minutes, to all appearances content to look out over the former fortress. Finally, Sumair spoke. "I thought you'd like to know. Hyoudou Ryodono will be visiting Kyoto this weekend. Ah. Kuroka wasn't sure what to say to that. Or what to feel about it, for that matter. She still wasn't sure what had possessed her to leave her number with Takemichi for the hiatus. The number for her real phone, no less, not the endless number of burners she had stockpiled. Just for a visit Naya. She poured herself another drink. Not really, Sumire said. Her daughter is being inducted into Grozobur. Kuroka paused in mid-pour, her brows knitting. Daughter. She set the saucer down, fixing Sumire with a piercing look. They don't have a daughter. They only have a Kanya. Apparently, they've recently adopted a friend's niece, Sumire said, giving the Nekashu a piercing look of her own. Kuroka's eyes widened slightly. That was almost certainly she hadn't thought about Asia in years. The last she'd heard, Dulio had taken her to the church and was keeping a close eye on her. What had happened there? Still, Asia wasn't the first thing on her mind. What about Akanya? It sounded like he and his fiancée would be coming along too, but as tourists. Sumire shrugged. The report was primarily focused on Hyoudou Dono herself. His fiancée, Even Kuroka hadn't been that disconnected from the devil grapevine. Iken and Sona Sitri, it wasn't something she could wrap her head around, but then, she hadn't seen Iken since she'd stormed out. Kuroka-ni. Come play with me, Kuroka-ni. I'm coming, Iken. What do you want to play today? The Dragon Prince and the Cat Princess. Fighting together to save the world. Kuroka-san. Sumire was studying her, and Kuroka realized she'd been woolgathering. Right, she said, a little more crisply than was probably necessary. Now, what I want to know is, why is the Yagashi family telling me this, Naya? What are you gaining? Reconciliation, perhaps. The hell you say, Naya, Kuroka retorted. We're seeking Kyoto's stability and prosperity, Sumire replied amiably. What affects the Akaji harem and her family has a potential effect on us. Particularly with the pact we now have with the houses of Grimory and Sitri, and Hyoudou Issei-kun's relationship with the Sitri heiress. Anything that can help keep that family stable is welcome. Kuroka flicked her ears in reluctant agreement. There's something else you need to consider, Sumire added. Kyoto may not have Grigori's reputation for taking in strays, but you were a yokai before you were a devil. Her serene expression was gone, replaced by utter seriousness. Yusaka Dono suspects a new time of conflict to be in the wings. It wouldn't be a good time for anyone to be caught out in the cold. I need to think about this, Naya, Kuroka said carefully. Of course. Sumire rose gracefully, leaving a business card on the bench next to Kuroka's sake bottle. I'll leave you to your drink, then. Kuroka nodded her thanks, raising a hand in farewell as the other woman left. She spent a long time looking out over the park, her expression giving no clue as to what she was thinking about. For the 300th time, approximately, since she'd said yes, Ravel Phoenix regretted accepting her brother's second bishop piece. For much of her life, she'd looked up to Riser. He was handsome and talented, the textbook description of a scion of the House of Phoenix. Ruvel Nayasama and Real Nayasama were just as talented and somewhat nicer, but the flair and panache with which Riser acted had convinced Ravel that he should have been the head of the family. It was only when she'd gotten older that she'd started seeing the flaws in his image. Those flaws had only become more glaring since she'd agreed to become his second bishop. The worst part was that since she'd accepted the peace, he had begun treating her little different than his other servants. She was half surprised he hadn't expected her to indulge him the way his other servants did, and she wasn't prepared to rule out him asking that. He'd have a rude, superheated awakening coming if he did, but it would still make things awkward. At least she was in good company, she reflected. The little psychopaths with chainsaws aside, most of his peerage had been welcoming of and friendly towards her. She was finding it especially easy to get along with Mihi, her fellow bishop, and Isabella, one of her brother's rooks. It was in their company she found herself today. Walani-sama was Mayo knows where with Ubaluna, probably using office furniture in a non-standard fashion. The three of them were in one of the family estate sitting rooms, Isabella reading a dog-eared copy of Slaughterhouse 5, while Mihi worked on a crossword puzzle. The daughter of the House of Phoenix rose to her feet, suppressing a yawn as she closed her laptop. She had spent the morning tracking the House of Phoenix's holdings on the Lucifer Stock Exchange and was ready to do something else. I need to get some fresh air. I'm going to the human world. Wait, Ravel-sama. Isabella rose smoothly to her feet with a grace that belied the rook stereotype. It can be dangerous. Let me accompany you. Thank you, Isabella-san. Ravel gave her a grateful smile. Of course. Isabella nodded in return. Where were you planning on visiting? I hadn't quite decided yet, she replied, her tone slightly sheepish. Mihi set the puzzle book down with an air of satisfaction. Evidently, she'd finished the one she'd been working on and in pen, no less. If you'd like, Ravel-sama, I could show you around the city where I grew up. That's very kind of you, Mihi-san, Ravel said, and she meant it. This might prove to be less an idle distraction and more an actually interesting excursion. You grew up in Kyoto, correct? He nodded, rising gracefully to her feet. Yes. It's been a few years since I've been back, but I believe I can still perform adequately as your guide. I will take you up on that, Ravel declared. And I shall buy lunch. Do you have any particular recommendations? Actually, I do. Mihi smiled. How do you feel about ramen? Ready? Issei wore charcoal gray slacks, a royal blue button-down shirt under an unbuttoned black vest, a black necktie, and brown loafers. Yes. Sona stepped out of the bathroom, smoothing down her skirt. It was light blue and denim, the hem brushing her kneecaps, and she wore a black sweater blouse with mock collar and black Mary Janes. A black purse was worn over one shoulder. She gave Issei an approving look. Very nice. Red is your best color, but blue looks quite good as well. And you look gorgeous, he told her, offering his arm. Smiling, she took it and they left the apartment. There you are. Ryo called out cheerily. We were starting to think you decided to stay home. Just got a late start, Sona assured her. You look very nice today, Ryo-san. Kind of you to say. Ryo smoothed down the sleeves of her himongi, which was the same color as her family's pyrokinesis. A long blanket-wrapped bundle was slung over one shoulder, undoubtedly a Noahabari. The fact that its presence wasn't making Issei itch implied some heavy-duty enchantment at work. She smiled at her son and future daughter-in-law. You two look nice and dressy today. Have big plans for your date. Sona-chan has something in mind for that, Issei said, rubbing the back of his head. His mother looked like her normal self or what he thought of as her normal self, anyway, and he was silently grateful for that. He'd had a bit of a hard time looking at her since the fight with Selen. The fact that she was actually young and hot under her graceful early middle-age facade was enough of a surprise, but her youthful self's resemblance to Kaori was really disconcerting. At least her scent hadn't changed, he reminded himself. That would have made things really weird. Fortunately, Asia chose that moment to emerge from the stairway and she smiled brightly at the sight of Issei and Sona. Nai-san. Sona-nisan. You look very nice. You too, Asia, Issei told her, resisting the urge to pat her on the head. His adopted sister was dressed in a dark teal blouse with a long flowing skirt of a slightly lighter shade and brown leather half boots. A small brown satchel was belted to her right hip and a silver crucifix necklace hung around her neck. I guess we're just waiting on senpai, then. Not anymore, you're not. The four of them turned to face Rias. The Gremory heiress was, undeniably, the most casually dressed of them, but her slacks and sweater were still of high quality and cut in a fashionable style. I apologize for the delay, but my brother called. Both Sona and Issei tensed slightly. The Sitri heiress asked carefully, is everything alright? Rias nodded. It sounded like things are quiet at the moment. He mostly wanted to make sure my peerage and I would be returning home for summer vacation. She smiled in a mock conspiratorial fashion. Ani-sama may be just the tiniest bit overprotective of me. I can't imagine what that's like, Sona said dryly. Rias chuckled. No, Serafal-sama isn't like that at all. She looked towards Ryo. Ryo-san, shall I handle the circle, or did you want to? Ryo nodded to her. Teleportation magic has never been my strong suit. Please, go ahead. Wait, Tusan's not coming. Issei said in surprise. Your father doesn't really like going to Kyoto any more than he has to, Ryo explained. It has a lot to do with shall we say, the recklessness of his youth. Besides, I think he had some plans for today anyway. Okay, I assume everyone knows how this game works, Goru said cheerfully as he finished shuffling the deck of cards. He wore a green dealer's visor and began dealing the cards. Yes, Goru, we know, Yulong said amiably. Thank you for hosting, by the way. We haven't really used this pocket sub-dimension much anyway, he said graciously. I may do this more often, now that Issei's part of the supernatural world. How is he adjusting, anyway? Tiamat asked. She wore her humanoid form today and already had her seat at the table staked out. She also wore a t-shirt that declared Thanos did nothing wrong, which left her friends puzzled. Pretty well, pretty well. It helps that he's already got a cozy setup with the Sitri heiress. Goru grinned. I can already see his harem starting to form. Don't think he quite sees it yet, though. Where do you want me to set the drinks? Alvin asked as he teleported in, hefting the casks of mead. Over there, thanks. I have a refrigeration spell set up on that shelf. Don't worry about the food, Tannen is getting the takeout. Tannen's already here with the takeout, the former Dragon King announced as he teleported in. Indeed, his arms were piled with pizza and Chinese food boxes and had a cloth grocery bag full of dragon apples slung over one shoulder. He'd bought nearly in bulk, logical, considering that he and his friends had dragon-sized appetites. Midai called out sick. He snorted. It's probably because he owes me gold for covering the pizza last time. He squinted at the cards and rolled his eyes. Ooh no. Really? Remember what happened the last time we played poker, Goro reminded him, and every dragon present shuddered. Lizard Dragon already apologized for that, Yulong pointed out. I'm not letting him back into the group until he actually pays for the damages, Goro declared. Alright, everyone, grab some food and we'll get started. The teleportation circle deposited them in an empty alleyway in Arashiyama. Ryo reached into her purse and handed small silver lapel pins to Issei, Sona, and Rias. Kyoto is full of shrines and temples, she reminded them. These should cushion you against any ill effects if you visit any of them. You might think of them as a kind of spiritual diplomatic immunity. She smiled. After all, you are foreign dignitaries of a sort. Even Issei would count, given his relationship to Sona-chan. Clever thinking, Sona murmured approvingly, and Issei and Rias both nodded. We were planning on visiting several shrines today. But would you three? We'll be meeting Rinai-san at Kiyomizudera, at least. Beyond that, it will depend on how the meeting goes. I'd like to pay a visit to Yasaka-sama if possible, but she may have her hands full with official business. Is there anyone you and Toussaint aren't friends with? Issei asked dryly. Sadly, yes, Ryo admitted. Some of them are still in Kyoto. But I don't think any of them will pull anything while we're here. Do you know Rinai-san? Asia asked curiously. Only by reputation. She's associated with Grigori as well as Grozobur and is supposed to be one of the master magicians of her generation. Grozobur? That's the one that Asia is signing on with, right? Issei asked, his tone more one of making sure than actually asking. Yes, it is. Ryo nodded. It's primarily active in Central Europe but also with active branches in Eastern Asia, Ryo explained. It has cordial relations with the Kyoto faction's mages. More to the point, its leader, Mephistopheles, is also a devil one with some literary fame. She smirked slightly, and Rias and Sona chuckled softly. So, as an organization, it has procedures in place for its members to contract with devils. How many magicians' associations are there? Issei asked. How many countries are there in the world? Ryo replied with a soft chuckle. Sona and Rias nodded in agreement and, much to Issei's surprise, Asia did as well. It's not really a joke, Issei. There are a lot of magicians' associations, but most of them are local to the country or region they're located in. There are a handful that have true international influence, like Grozobur. Interesting, Issei mused. There are a number of members of the 5 families affiliated with Grozobur, Ryo noted. She then smiled wryly. At some point, I need to introduce you to them formally. You're related to some of them, after all. The Daimon, you mean? Issei asked. Primarily. But there has been a fair amount of intermarriage between the families. Ryo looked over at Sona. Tsubaki-chan is a Shinra, right? So was my mother. She and Issei are likely cousins, then. What about the Himejima? Rias asked and smirked good-naturedly as Issei stumbled. More distantly, but yes. Ryo raised an eyebrow at Issei's reaction. My queen is a Himejima, Rias explained. Hyoudou-kun is scared to death of her. That's because I have a working survival instinct, Issei muttered. Sona rolled her eyes and patted Issei's back. She just likes teasing you, Issei-kun. Issei muttered something about White Olander. The Kendo sneezed and looked around. How strange. I wonder if someone is talking about me. Meeting at Kiyomizudera, It's almost like we're in a movie, Issei teased. Ryo smirked and shook her head. No Jidajeki antics here today, I'm afraid. She gestured at the crowds. We're supposed to meet Rinai-sen at the main hall. Not the veranda itself, sadly. Are you two heading off, then? Sona nodded. We'll be having lunch at Menbakechidai. Rias perked up. The fire ramen. It's open until 11 at night, senpai, Issei said hurriedly. I'm sure you could go in the evening. He rubbed the back of his head. We're going to Yasui Kanpiragu first, though. Ah, I see. Ryo gave them an approving smile. Never a bad thing to try and ensure the favor of the kami. That was our thinking, Sona said. She took Issei's arm. We'll be off, then. See you later. She and Issei raised their hands in farewell and joined the stream of foot traffic heading away from the shrine. Yasui Kanpiragu? Asia asked. It's a local shrine that is popular for people looking for or wanting to strengthen their relationships, Ryo explained. Or for people looking for help in leaving bad ones behind. Sona has a well-hidden sentimental streak, Rias commented. I'm sure she planned this from the moment she thought of coming to Kyoto. I don't doubt Issei was easy to persuade, Ryo replied with a slight smile. But we have our own appointment, don't we? The 2 younger women nodded and they headed for the stone steps. Rias adjusted the pin on her lapel, looking around with some slight nervousness. With a name like Lavinia Rinai, it was all but mandated that she was a foreigner and the figure waiting for them certainly qualified. She was a beautiful woman, tall and buxom with long blonde hair and sapphire blue eyes. She wore a long black pencil skirt and starched white blouse under the light gray robes and pointed hat that were the professional garb of Grasshopper members. She stood just outside the main hall, checking her phone, and the fact that she was managing to avoid being gawked at was the surest sign of all that she could do magic. She smiled as she spotted them and offered a polite bow. "It's nice to meet you. I'm Lavinia Rinai, with Grasshopper." She paused, then added, "Given the circumstances, you should be aware that I also work for Grigori." The three women from Kuo returned the bow. Rio spoke first. "We were already aware. I appreciate that you didn't conceal the fact from us, though. I presume that fact will not affect my daughter's status." Her polite but firm tone kept it from being a question. "Of course not." Lavinia's expression turned serious. "We're aware of the unpleasantness she's experienced at the hands of Grigori's rogue elements. We desire to avoid further such developments." "As do we," Rio agreed. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Rinai-san. I'm Hyoudou Rio, late of the Kyoto faction. This is my daughter Asia." She glanced at Rias, considering for a moment before continuing. "And this is Rias Gremory, a friend of the family. Pleased to meet you all." Lavinia paused thoughtfully as she turned to Rias. "The heiress to the house of Gremory, May I presume that you wish to contract with Asia once she's been inducted into our organization?" "That's right," Rias agreed, inclining her head respectfully to the magician. "Good. We're all on the same page, then." She finally turned her attention to Asia, her smile returning. "So, Asia. You wish to join Grasshopper?" "I do." Asia's expression was firm and also showed awareness of her unsure footing. "I have a sacred gear and I've been exploited in the past because of it." She cleared her throat before continuing. "Ka-san convinced me that becoming a magician would be my best chance of maintaining some control over my future." "Your mother has a point," Lavinia told her equably. "Let's get started, then." She shifted her gaze towards Rio. "I'm glad your friends were willing to arrange someplace quiet for us to study, Rio-san." "Yes, they were quite understanding when I explained the situation," Rio noted. The four of them began walking at a steady clip, making small talk as they left the temple grounds. 5 minutes of walking brought them to a closed storefront. Rio reached for the door, her fingers and the handle glowing slightly as she did. Once they had entered the narrow hallway, she closed the door securely, leading them down the hall to a battered-looking western door and rapped firmly against the frame 3 times before opening it. The frame pulsed dimly with white light after the third knock. Behind the door was a large, sunlit room, not unlike a dojo, with a surprisingly high ceiling at least 4 meters tall at its lowest point. The room was mostly empty, save for a low-slung table and a pillow for sitting. The table had a legal pad, a small stack of books, several mechanical pencils, and a calculator sitting on it. "Math," Asia said, a touch of resigned humor in her voice. "I remember being told that magicians use a lot of it even before Ka-san brought up becoming one." Lavinia nodded. "Mathematics are a big part of how magic works. It's not quite like a formula where you have to determine a different variable each time, though." She paused, then added, "Usually, at least. There are some rituals that do require just that. For example, casting counter magic against someone else's spell or ritual. But for the most part, once you've learned the spell, you can apply it anytime and expect the same result." Asia nodded, processing everything the magician said. She glanced towards Rio and said with a soft chuckle. "Ka-san, I've never seen you or Nai-san do this with your pyrokinesis. Both Issei and I have always been very good at math. As in, complex calculations in your head good," Rio explained. "Also, magic passed down through family heritage works differently. It's actually closer to devil magic in that will, desire, and mental framework play a large role. The magic you'll be learning with Grasshopper can be learned by anyone with basic magical aptitude. But I have a feeling that you have a specific magical affinity of your own, twilight healing aside." "I knew it," Lavinia said conversationally. "I was certain you had a son." "Yes," Rio replied with a nod. "I would like to bring Issei in sometime, but probably not in the near future. He accepted an evil peace recently in order to be with his fiancée." Lavinia raised both eyebrows. "That sounds like quite a story. Perhaps we can meet them for dinner." "I'm sure they'd be willing to share it," Rio said. She looked at the stack of books. "Those are the standard aptitude tests." Lavinia nodded. "It's through those that Asia will learn where her strongest magical talents lie. Her sacred gear notwithstanding, of course." She gave the younger woman a reassuring smile. "I have a sacred gear, too. The abilities it gives me don't always mesh with my actual magical inclinations. It may be the same for you." "What's yours?" Asia asked, perking up a little. "I'll show you once you're done with the aptitude testing," Lavinia promised. "Is it weird that I feel a little excited doing this?" Issei asked as he wrote on the slip of paper. "Maybe," Sona told him. She had already written her name and wish on her slip of paper. but I feel the same. So, at least you're in good company. I knew that already. They exchanged smiles. They had chosen a relatively low traffic time to visit Yasui Kanpiragu. Only a handful of people, the attending priest aside, were there, and they were the only couple. Issei studied the large paper-covered stone for a long moment. It's not going to move, Issei-kun, Sona finally said, good-natured sardony in her voice. I'm more worried about going in the wrong way, he admitted. Sona beat her head, but said nothing. This was, of course, something they were doing for fun. Half for romance, half for laughs, but still, getting it right was important. It was never a bad thing to avoid irking the kami, particularly when, according to Issei's father, so probably accurate, Issei was himself part kami. He finished writing his name and wish. Alright. Do you want to go through first, or do you want me to? But you promised to keep from looking up my skirt. Sona replied dryly. I'll try. You go first, Issei-kun, she said firmly, then added with an amused snort, I promise to try not to stare at your butt. She pointed at the front of the stone. That way. Issei nodded, clutching his strip of paper, and dropped to his hands and knees. He paused at the entrance to make absolutely sure he was going through the right way and started crawling through the tunnel. He could hear Sona moving behind him as he went. As he emerged, he got carefully to his feet and offered a hand up to Sona as she emerged. She nodded her thanks, taking his outstretched hand. Once they were both on their feet, they reached for the nearby pot of glue, carefully adding their wishes to the other slips of paper covering the massive stone. Issei let out a sigh of relief as he patted down his slip of paper. There. You're taking this more seriously than I expected, Sona said in a gently teasing tone. Maybe part of me's still afraid I'll wake up from this dream, he admitted. I promise you, that won't happen, she assured him, squeezing his arm. You're my rook and my betrothed, Hyoudou, Issei. You couldn't escape me if you tried. That's what I'm counting on, Issei replied, his tentative smile relaxing. His stomach chose that moment to growl, breaking the understatedly emotional mood. I suppose that means we'd better go to Menbakechidai now, Sona observed. Yeah, I think it does. Menbakechidai was slightly less busy than Issei had expected, but only just. The small restaurant made a habit of limiting the customers' stay to 30 minutes, and they arrived just as the changeover was starting. What that meant, in a practical sense, was that he and Sona were able to get seats together at the semi-crowded counter, instead of having to wheedle another diner into moving. The scents wafting upward from behind the counter were mouthwatering, though, and he and his fiancée exchanged smiles of anticipation. As the patrons settled in, donning the complimentary aprons for protection against splashing oil, the cook set to work. This culminated in them setting the bowls of oilless meat, vegetables, and noodles ablaze, and the gathered customers were suitably impressed, Issei and Sona included. One reaction stood out to Issei, a delighted feminine laugh, followed by a brief clapping of the hands. It was exactly the reaction he would have expected from Asia had she been present. He glanced in the direction of that reaction, his curiosity piqued. The girl was breathtaking in her beauty. Golden hair styled into twin drilltails framed lovely aristocratic features, and her dark blue eyes were intelligent and lively. She wore an indigo dress that would not have been out of place amid Akihabara's eggle crowds and clasped her hands together, watching intently as the cooks did their thing. Flanking her were two other women, both attractive in their own way. Something about the drill-tailed girl stood out more to Issei, though. The first one was tall and athletic-looking, a few years older than the other girl. Her strawberry blonde hair was cut short and shaggy, with 3 crimson highlights worked into her bangs. She wore aviator sunglasses and a navy military-style baseball cap, along with an olive-drab commando sweater, khaki cargo pants, black high-top sneakers, and a gray windbreaker. Her body language suggested that she was a bodyguard of sorts to the younger woman. The second was a lovely Japanese girl, also a few years older than the first blonde. Her dark hair was worn long and straight, and she herself wore a perfectly arranged indigo himangi with a golden bird pattern worked into it. Her body language towards the younger blonde was suggestive of an assistant or valet. The first girl became aware that Issei was looking at her and raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" she said, her tone polite but with more than a little haughtiness. Issei reddened slightly. "Sorry. Just your laugh a minute ago. It reminded me of my sister." "Oh." The girl was clearly nonplussed. Issei's answer seemed to have scotched any scathing reply. He'd settle for her polite confusion. "I see. Well, I suppose that's all right." Sona glanced over, looking curious. "Issei-kun, who are you talking to?" She trailed off as recognition sparked in her eyes. "Ravel-san." "Eh?" It was Ravel-san's turn to be surprised by a familiar face. "Sona-san. What are you doing in Kyoto?" Sona made a quick, subtle gesture. Issei recognized it as the invocation of a subtle privacy field, one which would mask their conversation and any discussion therein of supernatural matters as mortal, mundane chatter. My future sister-in-law is taking some tests and we're having a lunch date. Sona gestured to Issei. This is Hyoudou Issei-kun, my new rook and my fiancé. She smiled slightly. Issei-kun, this is Ravel Phoenix. Nice to meet you, Issei said, bowing as best he could while seated. Ah. Nice to meet you, Issei-san. Ravel returned the bow with equal awkwardness. I had heard that you were engaged now. Yes. I imagine certain people have made snide commentary, Sona replied dryly. Ravel shrugged, looking uncomfortable. People will do that. It's hardly their concern, anyway. She gestured to the women flanking her. This is my brother's rook, Isabella-san, and his other bishop, Mihi-san. The other two women nodded their own greeting. Mihi-san is from Kyoto, and she's being kind enough to show us around. Very kind, indeed, Sona agreed. Have you seen much yet? Not yet, Ravel admitted. Her cheeks were slightly pink. I insisted on lingering at Nara Park. The deer are quite adorable, Mihi said in a reassuring tone. I enjoy feeding them when I have the time. That's on our list, Issei told her. But we wanted the fire ramen first. As if on cue, Mihi took a quick experimental bite and nodded. For the next few minutes, all attention was on the freshly served lunches. Issei and Sona had deliberately gone light on breakfast in order to make room for the fire ramen set, and they made short work of it. It was Ravel who resumed the thread of conversation. Have you seen Ryasan lately, Sona-san? I have, yes. We attend the same school, Sona answered. She briefly caught Issei's eye, and he nodded slightly. It was probably better not to share that Ryas was in Kyoto as well. She's doing well. She paused for a long moment and then, in a carefully neutral tone, she asked, and how is your brother? He's well. He's the same as always, Ravel answered, her tone equally careful in its neutrality. Mihi and Isabella exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing to disagree. Into the silence, Issei ventured carefully, so, Mihi-san, you grew up in Kyoto? Yes, I did. The bishop seemed pleased at both the acknowledgement and the attempt to steer into safer conversational waters. My family has lived in Nishigen for generations, and we own a half stake in Kane. A soba restaurant. Issei perked up. I've heard good things about it. They're all true, Mihi answered, her body language relaxing. Out of the corner of his eye, Issei noticed Sona giving him an approving look. Perhaps sometime we can meet again, and I'll take you there. That sounds wonderful, Ravel piped up. She, too, seemed quietly pleased to have changed topics. The rest of their time in the restaurant was spent eating and making pleasant small talk. Finally, it was time to settle up, and the new acquaintances bade each other farewell. It was nice to see you again, Ravel-san, Sona said, and Issei nodded in agreement. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Kyoto. Thank you, Sona-san, Ravel replied, inclining her head politely. It was nice to meet you, Issei-san. I hope you two have fun on your date. You guys, too. On your sightseeing, I mean, Issei said. Ravel nodded, smiling slightly. And you. Isabella and Mihi made their goodbyes as well, and the three of them stepped out of the restaurant. Issei watched them leave and looked at Sona. She seemed nice enough. Are you sure she's related to Riser? Honestly, he's the odd one out in his family, Sona sighed. Most of his relatives are polite and reasonable. She started to reach for her purse. Let me do it just this once, Issei told her, blushing slightly as he reached for his own wallet. She smiled. As you like, Issei-kun. Once they themselves were back on the street, Issei suppressed a satisfied yawn. That was even better than I expected, he said. I mean, I expected it to be good, but I had thought there'd be more focus on the spectacle instead of the food quality. I can see that, Sona mused. But I don't think they'd get steady business if they skimped on the latter. She checked her phone, seemingly pleased at what she saw on the screen. Where do you want to go next? What do you have on your itinerary? He asked, glancing at her phone as well. He'd been watching her update the list all week. A lot of stuff, she admitted. None of it really time critical. She tucked her phone away. Well, we're in the area, so there's a coffee shop that does an unusual coffee drink. I'm at your service, Sona-chan, he told her in a mock formal tone, offering her his arm. She grinned at him, a cheeky smile that few at their school would have believed possible. I'll hold you to that. She took his arm, gently guiding him in the desired direction. End of the here. So that's it for today's video guys. Before you go, just like the video and share it with your friends. Bye.